of economic growth. That is, if we hear national income has grown this year by 2%, how much of that has really gone to each group in the income distribution? So let me start with one graph that shows you the share of total income, total national income going to the top 10% adults over almost a century. So in red on a pre-tax basis and in blue on a post-tax basis. So these look pretty similar to the original Piketty size series that we built about 15 years ago, except that now we really distribute total national income on a pre-tax and post-tax basis, and the individual unit is the adult. So they have those familiar U-shaped high levels of income concentration before World War II, a significant drop, a period of much lower income concentration, and then starting around the late 1970s, a sharp increase in income concentration, so that on a pre-tax basis, we are now at a level of income concentration where the top 10% has 47-48% of total income, pretty much the level that it had at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, if you look on a post-tax basis, you also have the same U-shape, but the uptick is less pronounced. And the key difference here is that between 1 century ago and today, we now have a much larger government. A century ago, government was about 10% of national income collected in taxes and then redistributed in form of taxes, of transfers and public goods. Now, in the United States, it's almost 1/3. Even though, you know, the US is still, by standards of advanced economies, a relatively small government country. It's not 50% of the economy like in France or Sweden, but it's still 1/3. And the overall tax and transfer system is still progressive in the sense that the rich, the top 10%, pays more in taxes than it's going to receive in transfers and a public good. And I want to emphasize that aspect because it is one of the striking charts that doesn't show a U shape. You know, we had this fascinating discussion this morning with Robert Putnam about the I versus we. Giving, you know, part of your income to taxes is really going from the individual, you know, to the community. And in the historical picture, the size of government has increased, you know, from 10% to about 30% by 1980. And after that, it stayed flat. That is, the size of government has not come down, even though there are lots of forces that have been described, you know, this morning that has pushed us toward a more individualistic society. And thus, the big government is what keeps us on an after-tax basis from having reached back, you know, the very high levels of income concentration. Now, just to put that in perspective, so why do we care so much about what happens to the top? How relevant is that? So I have two answers to that. So first, with the new figures we have, we can look further down the income distribution because we have a data set that represents the full US population, and you can look at shares of income going not only to the top but also to the bottom groups. And here, on a pre-tax basis, I show you the share of income going to the top 1% in red and the bottom 50% in white. And you can see that the two curves are mirror images of each other. The bottom 20% share has gone down from 20% or a little bit more in the 60s down to about 12% today, while the top 1% has increased from less than 10% to about 20%. So they've exchanged places in terms of share. This also tells you that there are enough gains that have gone to the top 1% that if you could somehow give them, you know, to the bottom 50%, you would be able to maintain the share of income going to the bottom 20%. So what has happened at the top is big quantitatively. There's enough money there to restore income growth for the bottom 50%, half of the US population. Another way to show why this increase in inequality is so striking in the way we're going to interpret the overall success of the US economy. So in the black chart here, you have the national income per adult on average in the full US economy that grows from $30,000 to $60,000 in 2014 dollars over that 50-year period. From 1980, which is roughly, the inflection point at which, inequality really starts to increase really fast, you have 60% growth on average per adult in the US economy, as it is measured by national accounts. Now, if I remove the top 10% and I look at the bottom 90% on a pre-tax basis, I get the white chart here that shows a growth of only 30% over that 34-year period. So really, you have only half of the posted macroeconomic growth. If you look at a group that is still the vast majority of the population, it adds the bottom 50% plus what you would call the middle class, the next 40%. If you focus only on the bottom 50%, that's the bottom chart here in red, you have essentially zero economic growth on a pre-tax basis for half of the population. We'd explain why their share has fallen that much. So disaggregating national accounts growth allows you really to see in a striking way how why unequal growth matters in the way people are going to experience economic growth. So another graph we produced is showing you the growth per year, annual growth on average from 1980 to 2014 by percentile. So if you look at the blue curve here on a pre-tax basis, let's start with the horizontal line. So that's the 1.4% per year. That's the average growth of national income per adult over that 34-year period. Now, by each percentile, you see that the growth rates are very different. They are actually negative for the bottom 30%. Then they are very low, for the next group, and they really reach the average only around percentile 88. So it's really the top 12% that has experienced the growth as good or better than the average. And then we can disaggregate further. And if you go to the very top, you get numbers of growth, that look like China, where you get 6% or 7% growth per year. This is repeated cross-section because it's a 34-year period, but it's looking at the same slices, of the distribution, 1980 versus 2000. Not the same people, obviously, over a 34-year period. So on a post-tax basis, you have, it looks a little bit better, but not that much. That is, in spite of, more transfers going for the bottom, you certainly don't tilt the curve so much that you restore equitable growth across years. So this panel is about human capital. So you can get income from labor and capital. And with our data, we can also break down what is labor income and what is capital income. And so here I just want to show you for the top 1% income share, that's the top line here, how each year it divides between capital income, returns on assets, marketable assets you own, versus labor income. So being paid, for your work. And you can see that in the increase of inequality, it was first pretty clearly a labor income phenomenon, where we see people at the top getting more labor income. However, over the last perhaps 15 years after 2000, it's become more of a capital income phenomenon, where people at the top are deriving, more from more returns from the assets they own. And so the related to this is, or a consequence of this is on the wealth inequality front. So this comes from a paper we did with my colleague Gabriel Zuckman a couple years ago, where we capitalized income, capital income derived from income tax return to reconstitute the wealth distribution. And so what we can see here, that for the top 0.1% wealth share, you have a U-shape like this, with a very large increase in the share of wealth going to the top 0.1%, from less than about 7% in the late 70s now to 20%. And for the bottom 90%, you have first a phase of wealth democratization with the rise of housing and pensions, followed by a collapse of middle class wealth, where the share of total US wealth going to the bottom 90% has fallen from a high of 35% now down to the low 20s, so that today, the share of wealth going to the bottom 90% versus the share of wealth going to the top 0.1% are about the same. And actually, the collapse of wealth for the bottom 90% really comes from a combination of increased income inequality, which means the incomes of the bottom 90% don't grow that fast. It's hard to save out of those income. And second, a collapse of the saving rate of the bottom 90%, especially with the expansion of credit, consumer credit, student loans, and the big mortgage boom. So those are the striking facts in the United States. What can we say about potential explanation? So I was supposed to talk after David Autor, who unfortunately couldn't make it today for personal reasons, who would have told you about human capital, the role of globalization and technological change. So I'm not denying that those facts are not important. They are important. But what I want to emphasize here is that they cannot be the sole explanation. And the simplest way to see that is that other advanced economies who go through the same phases of technological progress and are subject to the same forces of globalization, trading with China and other emerging countries, do not experience the same patterns. And so you can see that here, where for the first time we compare the United States and France on a fully comparable basis. That is, in both countries, we distribute national income, and we look at the top 10% share. So in red, you have the US numbers that I've shown you before, and in blue, you have the French numbers put together by Thomas Piketty and co-authors. And so what is striking in this one, that is, when you really include all forms of income, France really doesn't have that uptick. It really doesn't experience much of an increase in its income concentration, even though obviously, France trades with China, and in France, you have similar technological progress going on. So this means that other factors than globalization and technological change are going to play a big role. And let me emphasize two things. So the first one, what we should call, institutions. And you can think about unions, but also perhaps, fairness norms, something broader and harder to define, for an economist. And policies, that is what the government does in the form of taxes, regulations, for example, the minimum wage, but also many other forms of regulation, such as financial regulation, likely play a big role in how the pre-tax inequality is going to be shaped, which means that from the point of view of studying human capital, my very strong feeling is that the standard neoclassical model of wage determination is a very incomplete description of pay setting. There are other forces or powers, if you will, that play a role. Think about monopoly power, bargaining power, for workers with unions, monopsony power, perhaps, of employers. What economists call incomplete markets, but that's not a very good expression to define, what in the end, will feel like a power to set compensation. So let me discuss that a little bit further, because my feeling is that if we really want to understand the rise in top income shares in the United States, not in other countries, we really need to dig deeper in the role of regulations. That each of those has been extensively studied, as its own literature, but the connection with inequality has not been necessarily, thoroughly studied. So in the case of financial regulations, there is evidence that the financial sector plays a disproportionate role in the surge of US top incomes. That is, there is a little bit of work coming from Treasury researchers showing you that the share of income coming from the financial sector has actually increased quite a bit since 1980 in the United States. And there is also very interesting work by Philippon and Reshev showing that the size and the pay in the financial sector is tightly linked to regulations. Okay, and so this is so financial regulation, as we know, is fundamental for macroeconomic stabilization. You can summarize why did the Great Recession happen. It's essentially, a deregulated financial sector inventing a new product, subprime mortgages, that pumps risk into the system, and then the thing crashes. So as they were inventing those new products, the financiers were effectively taking a significant share of total U.S. profits, so it contributed, to the rise in inequality. So now we have the debate, about we had the Dodd-Frank regulation, and the new administration is considering whether we should remove those regulations. Antitrust regulation, I think, are also very important. We start to see evidence that market concentration has increased in recent decades, leading to a higher profit share and less consumer surplus. That is, the most successful global firms, if you think about them, in the technology industry, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, they really are able, to make very high profit because they work as a de facto monopoly with very significant market power because of their very strong position due to network effects. And when we think about the wave of deregulation that we've seen in the United States since 1980, antitrust has also, it seems, weakened and likely could play a big role, in trying to regulate those profits. And finally, labor market regulations likely also play a big role. These have been more studied by labor economists, and they've made the link, more tightly with inequality, so the shift to contracted work. So, for example, the Uber model, where Uber workers are self-employed instead of being salaried workers, or fee sharing within big corporations, where essentially corporations subcontract out jobs, low-paid jobs like janitorial services, for example. Some work, particularly in European countries where we have very good data, has shown, a very big impact on that. So analyzing the effects of regulation on inequality requires granular data on firm profits and individual earnings, something that was easier to get at in the case of European countries. So that's why many of those new studies are based on European countries, even though in reality, ground zero of the surge in inequality is the United States. So I hope that in the future, and the people, in this room, I'm seeing Fatih Gouvenen here, have also started leveraging, US administrative data. And I think there is a lot of fascinating work to be done in this area. So let me stop here.
Okay. Thank you. So our next speaker is going to be Professor Philip Jefferson. So he's going to talk about income mobility for college graduates. Thank you.
Thank you. And good afternoon to everyone. I want to thank those who organized this conference and Neil for inviting me to be a part of the conference and the Institute. I am honored to be associated with both. I also want to thank Sandra Samuels of the Northside Achievement Zone for her lunchtime discussion. I found it very inspiring, not only because of the great work that she's doing, but because she was also kind enough to provide me with some props or visual aids for my particular talk. The first thing I want to hold up is this T-shirt, which says that talks about college graduates for newborns, and it has their graduation year 2039. And I expect us to have this conference again in 2039, and I expect all of us to be here so that she can then tell us what happened to the outcomes of those particular kids. Also, she mentioned this yard sign, which I think is very important. And so you might wonder, well, why is he showing me these materials from Sandra's talk? Well, because in fact, they're quite related to what I'm going to talk to you today about, which is bachelor degrees and mobility. And you can think about my talk as tying in with what she said, because I will be discussing the outcomes from the type of initiatives and processes that she's trying to put in place for these younger people. Okay, so to do that, I want to first acknowledge my co-author here, who is named John Callia. John is a student of mine. He was in my econometrics seminar this semester, and he is a rising senior at Swarthmore. And he collected the data that will support my remarks. So one thing I was telling Sarah before the panel is that at Swarthmore, we work with undergraduates, the faculty that is, and they are our colleagues, they are our research assistants, and so this is clearly joint work, and so I won't use that hackneyed joke that says, well, anything you don't like about what I say today, you can blame on my co-author. That would not be true at all. In fact, John would say, anything you don't like about my talk today, you should blame on his co-author, which is me. Okay, so the concept of mobility that's going to be my concern is what's called lifetime mobility. Where lifetime mobility is defined as the change in an individual's position in the income distribution within that individual's own lifetime. We know that according to the Census Bureau, the percentage of adults with a college degree has risen from 28% to 33% over the last 10 years. And associated with that graduation from college is a premium in the labor market in terms of earnings. So parents seem to be increasingly concerned about their children's earnings prospects when it comes to their child's college choice. And according to the New York Times, if I had the clicker, I would switch to my next slide. Sorry, I should have gotten that before I started. So, I need to go back. So according to the New York Times, in fact, parents should be. So quoting James Stewart from an article in the Times this past fall, he says, it should go without saying that the value of an education should never be reduced to purely monetary terms. But college is a major investment. Students and parents should consult PayScale. I'm going to be talking about the PayScale data today, and the College Scorecard, which is a website done by the Department of Education, in order to understand the financial implications of their decisions. Okay? The question, though, is what, however, do the data from sources like PayScale say to concerned parents and students about the financial trajectory associated with choosing one school over another school, okay? So to address this question, we draw on data from PayScale's 2016-2017 College Salary Report. So PayScale, for those who may not be familiar with them, collects data from individuals who complete an online compensation survey. And PayScale claims that they collect more than 150,000 of these surveys per month. So the sample size for the entire compensation report, the 2016-2017 report, is 1.4 million degree-holding, full-time civilian employees working in the United States. The sample size for any one school ranges from approximately 50 surveys to approximately 4,000 surveys, depending on the size of the school. Now, John and I, we work with a subset of the entire sample known as the bachelor's degree only data set. And by that, what we mean, or what PayScale means, is that these individuals do not have a higher degree beyond the BA. So they do not have master's degrees, PhDs, MDs, or JDs, okay? I want to show you a table sort of summarizing these data. So what we focus on is the median salary for early career graduates and mid-career graduates with bachelor's degrees only from 963 colleges and universities in the United States. And what you can see from this table are some summary statistics, the mean, standard deviation, median, and the min and max. So from the means, we can see that the earnings profile or the salary profile is a positive slope in that the mean for the early career individuals is lower than for the mid-career individuals. And let me say what I mean when I say early career. Early career salary is for people with 5 years of experience or less. And mid-career salary is for people with at least 10 years of experience. And on average, the mid-career people are 44 years old and have 15 years of experience. Okay, so those are the two sets we're looking at. You can see that from the standard deviation that the distribution is more dispersed for the mid-career people, and this is perhaps intuitive because they've sort of spent time specializing according to their comparative advantages. There have been good outcomes, bad outcomes, and so that distribution is more dispersed. Because the medians are less than the means, we can see that there's some positive skew for both early career pay and mid-career pay. And from the min and max, we can see the spread, if you will, in these two distributions, whereas for mid-career pay, the spread is about $100,000, and for the early career pay, it is less than $50,000. So again, you see more spreading out, if you will, as people go on. So what we wanted to do was just take a snapshot look at the relationship between the medians for a set of schools. And that's what we do in this next figure. So what you're looking at here is a scatter plot of schools, 963 of them, and each dot in this figure represents a single college or university. On the horizontal axis, what I've plotted here is the log of early career salary, and on the vertical axis, I have the log of mid-career salary. Okay, and this is again for these 963 schools in colleges and universities in the U.S. So I want to call out just a few of these schools just so you'll get a feel for the different types that are represented in the data set. And I picked these schools randomly because their particular position in the graph just happens to be on the outskirts of the cloud, if you will. Okay, so I'm not trying to isolate any set of schools for any particular reason. So we see schools like Grand Valley State University, which is, I believe, in Michigan, Whittier College in California, Bates College in Maine, SUNY Maritime College, which is in New York City, Iowa State College, of course, in Iowa, Massachusetts College of Art and Design, Endicott College, which is in Massachusetts, and Shaw University, which is in North Carolina, right? Just so you're familiar with sort of with those schools. And what you see also in this scatter plot is an ordinary least squares regression line. And the equation for that line is given in the lower right-hand corner of this figure, where all we've done is regress the log of mid-career salary on the log of early career salary. N is the sample size, and what the R-square is telling us is that early career salary explains about 63% of the variation of mid-career salary. Okay, so what this line is saying to us, the ordinary least squares line, tells us how mid-career salary and early career salary are related on average. And if you wanted to, you could say, oh, well, schools above the line have a mid-career salary that's better than expected given their early career salary. So, for example, Bates College's mid-career salary is higher than expected given its early career salary. Now, the slope of this regression line is approximately 1.03, and that slope coefficient is statistically different from 0, and it is not statistically different from 1. And given that the data are in logs, then we can think of this slope coefficient as an elasticity, and therefore what it's suggesting is that the elasticity of mid-career salary with respect to early career salary is 1. Okay? So one way of thinking about this is that if the median graduate from school X earns 10% more than the median graduate from school Y at an early career stage, then that first graduate is predicted to earn 10% more than the second graduate at the mid-career stage on average. So this is another way of saying that on average, there is no catching up, okay, with respect to lifetime outcomes of the two graduates from different schools. And in that sense, it matters what school you go to, right? If you were to believe this relationship that we've documented here. Now, the implied correlation coefficient between log of mid-career salary and early career salary is 0.79. So this very large, positive correlation also suggests that there's not a lot of mobility within the lifetime with respect to the median graduate from these particular schools. Okay, well, part of our charge here today in terms of putting together this panel was to talk about challenges and questions. And so first I'm going to talk about some challenges with respect to these data the PayScale data. And then I will talk about some questions I think that the Institute could consider if in thinking about these types of questions of lifetime mobility. First, these data that I've mentioned today, the PayScale data, have all kinds of selection issues that are present. Just to name two, one, this is a non-random sample. okay? So PayScale does not make any effort to construct a representative sample of the overall population. Respondents are those who seek out the PayScale website, okay? Those are the people who we have the information on. Second, smaller institutions with enrollments of less than 5,000 students are less likely to be included. And for those who are included, estimates are less precise. So for example, Swarthmore College is not in this data set, okay? And there are at least two reasons why that might be the case. One could be not enough Swarthmore graduates filled out the survey. Or a second one could be many Swarthmore graduates filled out the survey, but because they went on to get advanced degrees, they were excluded from the sample. Okay, so only 963 of a possible 2,600 bachelor's degree granting schools are included in the subset that we look at. Second, these are non-administrative data, right? The salary figures rely on respondents' recall for accuracy. So respondents had to had to complete the PayScale survey successfully to even be included in the sample. And third is the issue of these data are proprietary, and because they are published by a for-profit company, we're not quite sure even how they're produced. So without access to PayScale's algorithms, we cannot know for sure exactly what they do and how they do it. Okay, so this leads to some questions, okay? And those include, first, should the Institute advocate for more comprehensive and publicly available individual level salary data linked to educational institutions? And why might the Institute do that? Well, because we want to be able to produce better estimates of economic mobility associated with college choice. That's the type of finding or information that the parents of these kids will want to know. Depending on what school they go to, what will be their lifetime trajectory. Now, there's some obstacles to collecting that data at the federal level, because for those of you who have read the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008, you know that the federal government, that act prohibits the federal government from collecting personally identifiable information on students and their employment outcomes. Okay, so that's written into the act, to the law. Okay, so the federal government can't do it. So what we see is some states trying to provide this information, but when the states do it, they tend to restrict their scope to graduates who are still within the state. So as graduates move from, so if you're educated at the University of Texas, but then you go to live in California, then you may not be captured in the Texas data set, if you will. Okay, so that's an obstacle built in, and the Institute can decide, or well, is there a position that one would want to take with respect to that limitation in data collection? Second, would be question is, what is the statistical relationship between PayScale salary data and traditional measures of labor market tightness, such as the unemployment rate, the quit rate, the employment to population ratio, or variables like short or long-term interest rates? Okay. Third, and finally, what would collaboration between the Federal Reserve System and a for-profit company like PayScale look like? Would PayScale be willing to share more of its data and methods with Federal Reserve System researchers, perhaps on some type of confidential basis? And the potential upside for that could be that PayScale will be the discovery of whether or not PayScale has multiple files on individuals over time, because of multiple job searches or job changes. And having that type of information would help us to understand better salary ladders and the set of skills that most closely trigger upward mobility. That concludes my remarks. Thank you.
So now we're going to shift our focus from college graduates to children, and we're going to have two very interesting presentations about the rise in instability of families and intergenerational mobility. Professor Sarah McLennan will go first.
So thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. So basically what I want to talk to you about today is I want to make this argument that non-marital childbearing is part of a negative feedback dynamic in which poor labor market conditions for men in Generation 1 are leading to lower parental investments in Generation 2 and ultimately to lower human capital and mobility in Generation 2. Okay, so this figure shows you the ratio of non-marital births to all births dating back to around 1960. So I think there are a couple of important points to come out of this figure. So first of all, the blue line in the middle is for the total population, and then the other three lines are for blacks, whites, and Hispanics. So you can see that the non-marital birth ratio is increasing for all groups. It's higher to start with for African Americans and Hispanics than it is for whites, but the trend is very similar for all the groups. One thing that's interesting about this trend is it kind of leveled off in the 1990s for the blacks who had the highest rates. So a couple of things happened in the 1990s. It was the best labor market we had for low-skilled men for quite a while. It was also welfare reform. So both of those things were going on. I also want to make a point here that I don't have a slide for it, but I have another slide that they told us only 5 slides, right? So is that this trend really differs by education of the mother. So for the mothers with in the top 25% of the education distribution over time, their ratio of non-marital births has gone from about 5% to 10%. In contrast, for the mothers in the lowest 25% of the education distribution, they've gone from about 24% to 70%. So huge differences here. So it's the least educated people who are being most affected by this trend. So this figure shows what's going on in other countries. Almost all countries have experienced this large increase in non-marital childbearing. So you can see at the far end there that the US, we're number 1 here. We do a much higher rate. This is looking now at single motherhood by age 15. So this is a combination of divorce and non-marital childbearing. But in the last 20 years, non-marital childbearing is a much more important factor for leading to single parenthood than is divorce. So you can see again the differences by the education groups, which you see in the US, very, very wide span. You see this same difference in all of these countries, with the exception of Italy. But it's not nearly as wide as it is in the US. So the US, we marry more and we have more single parents and more divorces and more of all of this stuff. So another important point here is that you often hear and you'll see statistics that'll show that in the Scandinavian countries, there's much higher ratios of non-marital childbearing. I don't know if any of you are aware of that fact. Well, that's true, but in those countries, and in France as well, all those births are to cohabiting parents, and those relationships are very stable. Cohabiting relationships among parents in these Scandinavian countries are as stable as marital relationships are in the US. Let's see. Okay, just a little bit about the causes. So everybody has been talking about the causes for the last 20, 30, 40 years. So it's clear that one of the causes is the decline in stigma about sex outside marriage and about single motherhood. So that's sort of starting in the sexual revolution in the 60s, which is probably related to the birth control technology. But there have been huge changes in the idea that it was shameful to have a child outside marriage because it meant that you've been having sex outside marriage. So that was a big change. And you can see this in the attitude surveys that people have done in the 60s and the 70s. There was just a huge shift in changes in attitudes. There was also the new birth control technology that came out in the 60s, the pill and then the abortion, which, according to Akerlof and Yellen and Katz, really changed women's bargaining position with respect to if they agreed to have sex in the old days, if they got pregnant, the man had to marry them, and that was called the shotgun marriage. So we don't have that anymore because now there are women who are willing to have sex without having a promise for marriage because we have the birth control. And so we have a lot more people sort of maybe hoping that if they got pregnant they would get married, but that doesn't really happen in the end. So that's contributed to this trend. So the third argument has been the decline in the labor market conditions for low and more recently middle-skilled workers. And this is the kind of marriageable man hypothesis. So really, William Julius Wilson, a sociologist, sort of was one of the first people to talk about this in the 80s. And his story was about Chicago and the deindustrialization of Chicago in particular. But the focus then was very much on the lowest skilled workers and their sort of lack of ability to support a family. I'd say one thing and I've done research with Kathy on this, maybe she'll back me up or say something else about it, but it's very clear that the men are still expected to bring home a wage. You know, it's even though we have a lot more gender equality in the labor market and all of that, if a man doesn't have a job, he is not viewed as an acceptable husband. So more recently, the increase in non-marital childbearing has occurred, it's almost entirely due to an increase in cohabiting couples since about 1990. And so it's also the case, though, that some recent papers have shown that it's related, that the recent increase, and these are people looking at county differences in rates and labor market conditions, is very strongly related to the decline in, or the level of middle-skilled jobs for middle-skilled men. So whereas in the 80s, the early 80s or the 70s, it seemed to be a phenomena at the very bottom end of the education distribution. Now it's really moving up. And if you look at the trends in this non-marital childbearing ratio by education, you can see that the middle education group is now beginning to look more, has closed the gap with the top group and moves away from the group at the bottom. So interestingly, another cause that was talked about for a while early on was that somehow all of this increase in non-marital divorce and single motherhood had to do with the growing economic independence of women. But it's very clear now that the women who have the most economic independence, that is the college-educated women, are the least likely to be having children outside marriage. I think they have, my sense is that they have come up with a better bargain. Their men are doing more around the house and they're sharing more. And so they've used their independence, but they haven't used it to live alone. So the final cause here that I want to say something about is the increase in income inequality itself. And that's related to an idea that Kathy came up with, but which we think has a lot of validity, which is the idea that there's a marriage bar out there. So it turns out that if you ask these these couples who have recently had a child outside marriage, do you want to be married or why aren't you married? Well, they all say not all of them, but 80% of them say they want to be married. They want to marry the father of their child, but they can't get married until they have achieved a certain level, a certain standard of living. So if you think about it, back in the 50s, you sort of got married in order to kind of move up the income ladder. But today there seems to be this idea that marriage is kind of a payoff for success. It's something that you don't do until you've shown that you can have a solid marriage. And maybe that's related to wanting to be an insurance against divorce or something like that. But whatever it is, it's kind of set in another dynamic, another feedback loop, if you think about it, because where is the marriage bar? Well, if you think about it, it's somewhere related to maybe the median standard of living of the married couples. Well, that's getting further and further out there. So as fewer people marry, then there's sort of the group that marries is more and more advantaged, and the income inequality just makes that worse. Then the idea that somehow this low income or low educated couple is going to be able to join that club just seems further and further away. And so there are, again, recent papers that relate income inequality at both the county level and the state level with changes or in rates of non-marital childbearing. So now let me talk a little bit about the consequences of this. And what I'm going to say today really comes out of a study I've been doing for the last 20 years. Because of this increase in non-marital childbearing, we were very interested in what is going on with these couples. What are they up to? What are they thinking about? What do they think about marriage and their kids and all of this? So we started following a birth cohort of children in 20 different cities, and they were born between 1998 and 2000. So we have about 5,000 families with a very large oversample of births to unmarried parents. So what I'm going to be saying now is really coming out of what I've learned from that data. So the first point is that there's enormous economic insecurity for the mothers and the children in these families. That's a big factor. It's they're poor, they're housing insecure, the material hardship, every indicator that you look at. If you're worried about what low income and unstable income does to children, this is a serious problem. The second thing we learned, and I think this was new, we didn't know it before, is that there's enormous amount of relationship instability and family complexity. So I have a slide here. So this just compares the trajectories of relationship transitions up to age 5 of unmarried mothers at birth and mothers who were married when they had their child. So there are big education differences between these two groups. So you can see that the unmarried mothers have 42% of them have experienced no changes since the birth, but the rest of them have had a new partner, a new breakup, and maybe a new partner after that, and another breakup. Very much more multiple partnerships than you would find in a couple who were married at birth. And that leads to something that we call family complexity, because now the mothers are much more likely to have children with different fathers in the household. So if you think about, well, so what's so different? We used to have divorce, we'd have remarriage, but in the old days of divorce, you kind of didn't get divorced maybe till 7 or 8 years after you were married, and you had your 2 children within that union. But what's happening with the non-marital childbearing is that you start with a non-marital birth and you haven't finished your fertility, and the relationship is very, very unstable. So you're sort of searching for the right partner at the same time that you're in your peak fertility years. So that creates a lot of this family complexity. I want to go back. Okay. So what does all of this mean? It means lower parental investments in the children. It's lower for fathers because when the father doesn't live with the child, the cost of the child goes up to the father. That's just one thing. But if he's not getting along with the mother, that increases the costs. So the father that doesn't live with the child is less likely to contribute money. And then think about it. He may have 2 or 3 different children, 2 in different households, and maybe the third one he lives with. So the more children he has in the different households, the costs of kind of trying to visit them and contribute to them goes up. It's also, when he gives money to one of those households, he's probably giving it to a household in which another man's child, if not the man himself, is living. So there's just lots of reasons why this father wouldn't want to contribute to one of those former households. So that really reduces both the quantity and the quality of the time he invests in the child. For the mother, you have a similar situation. So if you've ever been divorced, Collecting child support is not that easy, and arranging visitation is not that easy. So you've got to find a time the father can see the child. The father doesn't always come. He doesn't always pay the child support. So now imagine you've got 3 children with 3 different fathers. So that's a full-time job. Just organizing, trying to collect the money from the different fathers, trying to arrange times when the father can see the child, trying to deal with the jealousies of the new partner and your new husband. So this is an enormous amount of just, I don't know maybe what economists call it, transaction costs or something, but it's just a lot of stress and a lot of time and a lot of energy goes into this. And if you believe that people only have so much energy to invest in their children and the lack of time sort of undermines their ability to be good parents, this is all you need to know in order to say the mothers on average cannot be doing as much high quality mothering in these families. And so what we find in the end is that there are worse child outcomes in these families, even when you control for all the variables that you would want to control for. Health, there's some evidence about higher obesity and asthma, but I don't think that that evidence is not as strong and the differences there are not so large, perhaps related to some of the things Janet Curry was saying this morning about we really do have a much, much better health system now to take care of these children. The behavior problems or soft skills or these non-cognitive skills, as people call them, there are huge differences here, and especially for the boys. So for some reason, these boys in these families are much more affected by the instability, the fathers moving in and out, the new partners moving in and out, and you can really see large differences in their behavior problems. And then it turns out there's educational attainments. So there are big gender differences now, we know, in educational attainment, especially at the bottom end of the distribution. And I think it's related to the fact that these boys have many more behavioral problems. It's not a cognitive problem. It doesn't affect their scores on their verbal and math tests, but it affects their behavior. So these boys are much more likely to skip school, to not be engaged in school. And so these are the kinds of issues that I think leads to their lower educational attainment. And I would say on the behavior problems and the educational attainment, there really is pretty good evidence for causal effects here. Okay, so what can be done? So I think, the norms about sex and single motherhood, that's not going to change. I don't think we're going to put that genie back in the bottle. I don't think we're going to change the birth control technology and the fact that there's been this sort of new idea that the woman is responsible for making sure she doesn't get pregnant. It's not the man's responsibility. I think the big issues have to do with decline in the labor market opportunities of not just the low-skilled jobs, but of the men now in the middle-skilled labor, because that's where the non-marital childbearing is really increasing. I think the income inequality is playing a role here because it's making it harder for the low-income couples or the low-educated couples to think they can reach this marriage bar. And then I'd add one thing here, which is about delaying the childbearing. So the women, we've really had a big decline in the teen childbearing, which is a big success. But most of that has just moved into the very early 20s. And when people partner and have children in their early 20s, they don't make as good decisions. It's just a matter of that. In fact, we've looked at the single moms in the study who are no longer living with the father. We've looked at who their new partner was, and they're definitely trading up. So the next guy they've got, more likely to have a job, less likely to have been in jail, all the kinds of things. So I think if we could just get them to delay that pregnancy a little longer, we might get some benefit from that. And then I had a few compensatory things here, which had to do with increased economic security for single mothers. There are lots of ways to do that with EITC and all kinds of things. Provide stable housing. I think housing is much more important than I used to think it was because of all this other instability. I think at least providing some stable housing could be a special benefit to these single mothers and their children. And then last, I would say that the high quality childcare in preschool is the most important factor. So I was thinking, as Janet was talking this morning, about all we've accomplished with Medicaid for poor kids and CHIP and programs like that. So the federal government's done a lot in terms of the health care. We've done much, much less in terms of the early child care. We seem to be getting very interested in it now. So I think that's a kind of good news. But I think that the quality of the care and the preschool, right now we've got in the school system, poor kids go to very different schools than wealthier children. I mean, it's just totally different. I've looked at this in our data, and it's just amazingly different. And so if we do the same thing in childcare and preschool that we've done in our K through 12, that's not going to be enough. We need to bring these kids into really high quality childcare and preschool. And then I want to end by just saying something that we should stop doing that I've recently noticed. We've been looking at the kids when they were 9 years old. It turns out that these boys, and especially the black boys, who have the more behavioral problems. So what happens when they go to their schools? They're going to schools that are very high in expelling and suspending kids. So you've heard about the the school to prison pipeline. So we've looked at this a little bit, and it's quite amazing and a lot of it has to do with the kind of schools they're going. They're going to schools that have these policies that are much more likely to expel or suspend a child with high levels of behavior problems. So, and you see this and the black boys with behavior problems are more likely to be expelled than the white boys with them. These are not in the same schools; they're in different schools. So it's just you could if this goes back to the pre-K and childcare, you're going to have the same problem. It's interesting because some of these schools, they're calling themselves no excuses schools or various things, and some of them, it's sort of interesting to think about what exactly do they think what's the motive of this suspending and expulsion. So boys are, they're problems, that's for sure. I have grandsons, they're not ready to sit still when they're age 5. And so I think it's really, really important that these, whether they're charter schools or public schools that we're putting into these low-income communities, I think high expectations are good, and that's all a good thing. But the idea that to punish the kids for not standing in line and for doing these little minor kind of things in 3rd grade, that's the group I'm looking at, 3rd grade. I think this is a disaster that we could be putting on to the next generation.
Thank you. So our last speaker is Professor Katie Eden. And Katie will also talk about family complexity and instability and effects on children.
First of all, let me say it's great to be back in my home state. I was born here in Minneapolis at Swedish Hospital on May 26th, a couple of years ago. Second, when I came in, I've been hiking with college roommates, so I just came in this morning. And I said to someone, it's great that there are 2 sociologists in this group. And he said, oh no, there are 3. And Bob's already laughing. And he said, Robert Putnam. And, I know Robert is actually a professor of government, but I, feeling a little outnumbered, said, I'll take it. And I am convinced that after you hear Sarah's remarks, my remarks, and the remarks of Bob this morning, you too will want to convert to sociology. So Sarah's remarks couldn't have been a better setup for what I'm going to say. And you might think of my remarks, if you kind of think about the causes and consequences Sarah laid out, you can kind of think of it as a sofa. And, her remarks are like cushion 1 and cushion 2. And my remarks might have initially appear like the loose change that falls beneath the cushions. But I'm going to argue that this loose change might well be a treasure trove. We don't really know yet. But I hope to spark your thinking and maybe make some even controversial remarks. And I'm doing so based on hundreds of conversations my colleagues, especially Tim Nelson and Marie Gafalis, and I have had with disadvantaged parents, mothers, fathers, and couples in 8 cities over the last 20 years, plus my demographic work, often in collaboration with Sarah, and other quantitative data, including that coming from randomized controlled trials. I will say that while my remarks remain speculative, I think they could hint at something profound. So keep in mind, we're in between those couch cushions. I'm not saying that any of the things that Sarah said aren't crucial, but we're kind of looking in between those two things. Now, some of you know that in my 20s, my dissertation advisor, Christopher Jenks, actually convinced me to spend 6 years running around the U.S. asking hundreds of single mothers how they made ends meet. And of course, that book with Laura Lane is called Making Ends Meet. And in the aftermath of its publication, I spent several years doing literally hundreds of radio and TV talk shows. And I would talk about how tough it was to make ends meet, either on welfare or low-wage work. And my audiences were like, yeah, but Professor Eden, why don't they just get married? And as a card-carrying sociologist, I had absolutely no idea of the answer to that question. I had literally gone across America talking to single mothers, and I hadn't thought to ask that question. Second, they asked, why do they have, if things are so bad, why do they have the kids in the first place? So, I thought that it was a great idea to grab my next set of research questions for my 30s from these insights in radio and TV talk shows, and so spent my 30s going across the country asking these questions of low-income mothers, fathers, and couples. And so I'm really drawing on those rich experiences with all of the parents we've met over so many places, but also in articulation with demographic data. And the key lesson I've taken from these experiences is that any strategy to improve mobility has to include the family context into which children are being born and raised. And just to remind you, maybe in a more visual form of what Sarah is saying, and this is the fundamental reality we really have to confront, right? The typical low-income family does not look like this. This is a single mother with a non-custodial father and a focal child, but much more often it looks like this. So I want you to keep that image in your minds. And this is simply another way of illustrating what Sarah was saying, that the vast majority of children born to unmarried parents experience instability, complexity, or both by their 5th birthday, with all of the consequences to children Sarah pointed out. And of course, not only is this historically unique within the US, this is new, we are also unique among rich nations, as Sarah showed. And this is a cause and a consequence for inequality. So that's why I'm talking about this. It's why this is important. And what I'm going to ask then is what can account for these trends. So we have some of the big picture from Sarah, but I'm going to take you into this micro-level qualitative data that we've been collecting over the last 20 years. And I'm drawing centrally from 2 works, Promises I Can Keep, which I wrote with Maria Kafalis, and Doing the Best I Can with Timothy Nelson. And what these books really describe is a sharp class divide in the process of family formation. So we're zooming in to the process of family formation. So what we learned from these interviews is that in contrast to advantaged parents, which I'll get to in a minute, the modal birth to an unmarried parent is unplanned. If you ask women, they'll say, well, I didn't exactly plan it, but it wasn't exactly an accident either. If you ask men the same question, they'll say, I just wasn't thinking at the time. It's really interesting. No woman that I've interviewed has said that. Okay. But in both cases, there's sort of this level of either ambivalence or really a lack of thinking prior to the pregnancy. These births are usually ill-timed, typically coming only 6 to 7 months in the process of what we might think of as courtship, although, as we argue, we have to think about courtship very differently here. In many cases, these young people simply don't know each other very well at all at the time that a conception occurs. In Doing the Best I Can, we talk about how couples say they're not in a real relationship, but they're together, meaning there's some level of cohesion. But when parents are explicitly saying, I wasn't in a real relationship at the time my child was conceived, you're in for trouble, right? The glue that keeps couples together, the shared interests and values and tastes, how you roll up the toothpaste tube to what faith you practice, is often just not present. And of course, that's part of why these relationships are so fragile. And these births are happening at a time in the life course where young people have not found their life path. Now, let me tell you that overwhelmingly, over hundreds and hundreds of interviews, nobody or very few people think this circumstance is ideal, including people for whom this has happened. Okay, so this is maybe a second best, but it's certainly not the ideal. Now, we're going to take you right into the field so you can get a flavor of what this process of family formation is like. And we hear a lot from moms in qualitative data, so I'm gonna use dads' voices. This is John. He's white, 24. He's got a 5-year-old, and he works as a window tinter. All these dads live in Philadelphia, Camden. Now, he says, actually, she was dating a friend of mine, and somehow she wanted me, but it was my friend's girl, so I didn't want to have nothing to do with it. But then my best friend, he heard some shit and started talking shit and saying he would kick my ass. So I was like, whatever, then I will be with your girl. Eventually, I just got stuck with her for a while. So that's kind of extreme, right? And he says this of the woman who just 5 months after meeting would become pregnant and shortly thereafter would give birth at the Cape May Medical Center to his first son. Amin, a 39 African American, he's got 2 kids, and he's really talking about his second child's conception here. Well, my youngest son's mother, I met her at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. She was attractive to me when I first saw her, and I made my approach. And we began to socialize and communicate. And from there, we began to affiliate. And at some point in time, we became intimate. And my son was born. So I often say to audiences, what's missing from that quote, right? What word? Okay, there you go. A+. Bruce White, he's got 2-year-old twins. He sells blood and works day labor. He told us, you see, I'd been running around with different girls, but every time I had a relationship, there was no babies born. So I didn't believe in safe sex. And the next thing I knew, this girl, Debbie, she was pregnant. After we got together about 4 months, she comes and says, Bruce, I'm 7 weeks pregnant. I said, I am shooting blanks. You can't be pregnant. Then we went for a DNA test, and that was when she found out that I was the father and she was the mother. Tim, 23, white, with a 3- and 5-year-old. He's a roofer, says, I was hanging around at a friend of mine's house, and her and a couple of her friends were there, and she used to go out with my friend. My friend was trying to get back with her, and I ended up getting with her. We were only together for about 2 months, and she was getting pregnant, and I didn't mind at all. So this is very much what Sarah was talking about when she was saying that people are looking for a partner but having children along the way, sort of at the same time. And so what these quotes are meant to illustrate is just the haphazard process of family formation. Again, a process that nobody who is involved, or virtually nobody who's involved, actually thinks is ideal. Meanwhile, right, we know from our own experiences and from demographic data that the modal birth for an advantaged parent couldn't be further from the story I've just told. These births are often meticulously planned. I watched this with my graduate students. It's absolutely astonishing. 2 are pregnant right now. The level of planning is astonishing. They're often ideally timed. They occur in the context of relationships that are often very stable and have become increasingly stable over time, right? At least since the divorce revolution. And they occur only after both he and she have sort of arrived career-wise. So as Sarah said, this has allowed for these unprecedented investments for children at the top, but really a withdrawal of investment for children at the bottom. All right, so what might interrupt this pattern? Now, we could apply all of the solutions that Sarah talked about here. So I'm not meaning to discount any of those. But I want to point out to something else. A friend of mine, Nisha Patel, actually coined this term after I tried to explain what I meant. We're now calling this thing SPARKS, which stands for something, Supported Pathways to the Arts, Recreation, Knowledge in Schools. These are positive youth development activities that give a key sense of meaning and identity, often with the added advantage of positive pro-social peer relationships and meaningful relationships with adults. They often come along in adolescence at a part in the life course where meaning and identity formation is crucial. I've lifted, and they can be either in or out of school. And for the few times in which we've actually measured family-level outcomes, because of course many of these programs do nothing to try to intervene in the family directly, we really see some astonishing results. So I point first to career academies. And I apologize that this slide has percentages versus percentage points. I know economists prefer the latter, but I'm hoping to convert you all to sociology, so hopefully you'll forgive me. But listen to these results. So men who went through these meaningful high school experiences, close relationships with adults, attached to an industry, we don't see test score gains or graduation gains. We do see some employment and earnings gains 8 years later, but the family gains are simply stunning. These young men are 33% more likely to be married, 46% more likely to be a custodial parent, right? 30% more likely to live independently with a partner and child. Now, the impacts are bigger on the men than the women, but there are some impacts for women as well. So amazing for a program that doesn't even attempt to intervene in family formation. Now, there's also a meta-analysis of high-quality after-school programs focused often on young women. One of these is career, but there are many others. And these show impacts of between 15 and 50% on the probability that a young woman still in high school will become pregnant. So SPARKS are the because, right? They're the because that can interrupt the haphazard process of family formation. Young women are often, when they're young and disadvantaged in particular, facing a dearth of opportunities to develop meaning and identity. And these sparks are really this powerful, profound because that seem to be interrupting this pattern. They have direct effects on mobility in some cases, such as career academies, but they can also have these powerful indirect effects through their impact on family formation. And they not only help the prospective parents, but the next generation as well. So they're a threefer. With two colleagues, I've just completed a book really centering on the meaning of these activities for young people. And this is Vicki. For her, in this book, we call it identity projects. For Vicki, really, it's amazing. We spent a lot of time with Vicki. She didn't really want to talk very much. All of the kids in this book were part of the Moving to Opportunity experiment, so very, very disadvantaged kids. And we were trying to figure out, what distinguished the kids who stayed on track for the kids who really fell off the rails. And we tried all of the standard variables. But this inductive concept that was just bleeding up out of the data for the 150 kids we followed over 12 years' time, half boys and half girls, that predicted who would stay on track better than any other, was the presence of one of these identity projects. So in the middle of our second interview, I think it was with Vicki, she she looks at us and says, "Hey, you want to go see my birds?" You know, we go to the backyard, and she's built, along with her father, this amazing set of pigeon coops. And she begins to describe to us how she goes all over Baltimore flying her pigeons. And her goal is to have flown her pigeons in every single city park by the time she graduates from her 2-year associate's degree program. Bob has a slightly more a kind of identity project that's even more closely related to mobility. He and a group of pro-social peers have gotten very into gaming. They've also gotten into white punk rock. Weirdly, the Insane Clown Posse is their favorite group. They are also really into anime and attend the Anime Festival in Baltimore every year. So connections with pro-social peers. And finally, Cody has joined the Police Explorers League, where he actually has institutional resources and these meaningful relationships with adults. And those are the kinds of identity projects that are the most closely associated with staying on track. Now, I want to just bring up 2 other considerations. First of all, we do know from following the young people and coming of age in the other America for 12 years, along with interviewing their parents, siblings, and observing them in school, that sparks are not the whole thing, right? Family can often really claw at you, as Brittany, one of our young respondents, says, like crabs in a bucket. This is a young girl who got a National Merit Designation after taking the PSAT in the 9th grade. When I met her, she was all set to go to Harvard. She didn't know I was teaching there at the time. She was so motivated, but over time, multiple traumas in her family, including 3 murders. There was just another one, actually, the other day, bringing that total to 4, began to really corrode her confidence and her sense of self and her ability to cope. She is stable now and in a stable relationship with her daughter's father, but she did not make it to Harvard. Secondly, we point to tremendous traps in the post-secondary educational market. My dad was a pioneer of post-secondary education here in the state of Minnesota. But the modal, 70% of our kids who had graduated from high school by studies age had enrolled in college at least once. 70%. But the most common type of school they chose was a for-profit trade school. And the book and your own experience chronicles the tremendous exploitation of these kids at the hands of these schools. So we really have to look at that. And of course, the labor market, as the fishing slide indicated, is without that college degree, offering fewer and fewer pathways to success. 2 other things for your consideration beyond investments in adolescence. And I hesitate to say the first because there's so much emphasis on early childhood. I don't want you to forget the adolescence. Right? So many decisions happen between age 16 and 24 that permanently alter the life course. But we know from the Perry Preschool at 40 report that attending Perry Preschool led to a huge increase in the percentage of men who raised their own children. A preschool. And second, we know from the Moving Opportunity Experiment, the most recent paper by Chetty, Hendren, and Katz, that changing the neighborhood context when someone is still young, taking someone from a high-risk neighborhood and moving them to an average neighborhood, that's essentially what MTO did over time, can profoundly affect family formation as well. 20%, in this case, a 23% reduction in the proportion of young women who were single mothers by study's end. So I'll leave you with that, and I'm going to enjoy the discussion.
Thank you. So let's open the floor for questions. Maybe I can ask the first question. So if David could come, he was planning to talk about the decline in male participation, especially among non-college men. And Katie mentioned that family instability especially affects boys' emotional and social development. So do you see a link between these two things that's happening in the U.S. economy?
I'm not sure yes, I always use one of David's slides when I generally give this lecture in my class, because I think what he's showing with what's happening to these middle skilled men, and of course the low skilled men, that it's very consistent with what's going on with the family formation. Is that what your question?
But what I was alluding to is most likely these boys who grow up in unstable families are more likely to have lower attachment to the labor force and
that's
not have
definitely the
good labor
point.
market outcomes.
I'm trying
and
to
also,
make that
the
point.
causality goes the other way around. Most
This
likely.
is the next generation, and it's not looking very good for them, and it's partly because of the family situation. But then when they get to schools, the schools sort of beat up on them. I mean, the schools are full of female teachers in elementary school that want little boys to sit still, and they don't sit still. And, and there's no, I guess, I don't know, there's no community around sort of standing up for them or something. I feel like, if the things were happening in an upper middle class school in New York City, the parents wouldn't put up with this for 5 minutes. But I don't know why they're able
I know
to.
that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I see it happening with the next generation of males.
Yes. Yes.
Dennis Lockhart, formerly with the Atlanta Fed. The question for Emmanuel Sayers. It's a methodology question, looking at inequality. Do you ever adjust the numbers for the effect of demographics? Do you adjust the numbers for the effect of demographics over time? The logic being,
as the age distribution of society gets older, you're going to have some wealth concentration with older people, and you're going to have incomes concentrate more, incomes affected by people in their prime earning years. So that's the first question. And the second is, what would the numbers look like if you used a kind of trimmed mean approach and you lopped off the extremes of the top 1/10 of 1% and whatever be the equivalent at the bottom, then what conclusions would you draw if you looked at the numbers in that way?
Those are good questions. On the age effects, so the numbers I've shown you here are for the full population, so not correcting for age, but obviously there is a strong life cycle pattern of earnings, right? People earn and then they retire, they don't work anymore. So the way we deal with that in the simplest way is that what we call pre-tax is actually after the operation of the pension systems, private and public, so that Social Security or a pension you might get, is counted as income when you are an elderly. So that corrects, for the rising, the aging of the population. But you can also do something much simpler of looking, at within narrow age bands. And for the increase in income concentration, you find almost the same effects. That is really the surge in the top 10% or top 1%. Income share has essentially nothing to do with aging. On the trimmed mean, so obviously, a significant share of the increase in income concentration has taken place within the very top group. The top 0.1% has gained, something like 7 national income points. So that's a very, very large number. So obviously, if you trim that, you would get substantially different results, but you would also get then substantially different results, for overall economic growth. That is, those 7 points of national income are real, and they are going to a very narrow slice. So that's why actually, the Piketty size series were seen as valuable, because we use tax data, that captures the very top of the distribution, while surveys, that essentially have to trim the top. They can't really measure the top well, was leaving that away.
Yes.
So I'm sorry, it's still a question for you, Emmanuel. So it strikes me, if there's a sense of crises, it's this, that given how much goes to the top, unless you had some unbelievable growth in the economy, it would be very hard for the bottom 50% to see a 3% growth, because they're getting such a small share. So an idea that we can just promote growth isn't going to be sufficient to address this. And if growth, if the inequality begets an inequality, that is, if so much of the resources are at one end, the market tips that way, right? Because that's where the money is. So if I'm going to sell something, I have to sell it to the end where the money is. They're the market. So as they become to dominate the market, then it strikes me that envisioning how you would correct it using the market to allocate resources would be very difficult to imagine. So how do we look at the imperative of growth versus finally addressing this inequality, and are we giving the proper weight to addressing inequality given how extreme this is? And how much can we rely on the market given that this level of inequality has already tipped too much of the market and market activity in the way things develop towards that end?
So on that one, I should say that when you start, disaggregating income growth, what really strikes you is that growth, is an abstract number, the 1.4%, growth of national income per adult. It's a very abstract number. So in reality, what you want to care about is where growth is going, and different policies are going to affect, different groups very differently. I mean, we heard from the panelists that things, there are what economists would call, inefficiencies or dysfunctions at the bottom of the distribution, and by spending more, promoting some of those programs, you can have actually good impacts on overall economic growth if you can get higher education, more intergenerational mobility. So I would say we have to be prudent, saying my policies are going to favor growth, to me doesn't mean much. I really need to know, growth where.
I'd like to add something on that, because I know the World Bank has adopted this objective of looking at growth in the lowest 40th percentile of the income distribution, and that using that as a standard for saying whether or not growth is equitable. So if you adopt that as an objective, then I would think it would necessarily follow that the policies that one would prescribe would be aligned with that objective.
Yes, Jenna? Yes.
So I want to cheat and ask two questions. So I have a question for Kathy, which is that I think what you showed at the end is really provocative, that these programs for teenagers that don't have anything to do with family formation and probably don't even mention it, nevertheless seem to have a big effect on family formation. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why you think that is. And then I also had a question for Emmanuel. I think it's great, actually, been very interesting to see the results pre and post-tax. So you can see that at the bottom of the distribution, it does help a little bit to give transfers. But what I wondered was if it's even possible, or if you've thought about putting in non-cash transfers to say what's going on at the bottom and how much we're sort of raising people out of poverty or giving growth in the form of non-cash transfers?
So I guess I'll start. Great question. Thank you for that. With the adolescent investments, what you see when you read sort of the detailed implementation reports of career academies, for example, or you hang out with youth as we did in Baltimore, is these programs, these positive youth development activities are really coming at a key part of the life course, where young people are saying, who am I and what is my life about? And what Maria Kafalis and I show in Promises I Can Keep in particular is that actually in Doing the Best I Can too is, the children end up filling that void in the absence of other things. We tell a story in Doing the Best I Can about Andre Green. He's actually the first young man we interview. We're living in Camden. And he was very young when he conceived his first child. It was not a stable relationship. And yet when he found out he was going to be a father, he ran up to his room, closed the door, and began shouting, "Thank you, Jesus," with his, making fist pumps. And he saw this, as just a chance in some ways to make a new start, to overcome sort of the deficits of his own father, to do something positive in an environment that's overwhelmingly negative. But when you add in sort of the MTO results and the results from peri-preschool, I think what we're seeing, and again, I'm guessing, is that for one thing, kids may be picking up on societal signals that they're worth something, right? You're improving their education, you're improving their neighborhood conditions, you're telling them they matter and that they have a future. Something is going on when we invest in kids from cradle to college, and this is perfectly compatible with what we heard at lunch. That's creating a better and more competent citizen in some ways. You see all these surprising benefits outside of the realms in which the education is focused. Keeping that in mind, we need to know a lot more about this, and we're not going to know a lot more until we realize that all policy is family policy. And if we would begin to systematically measure family outcomes of a variety of interventions, we might be able to actually answer your question with data rather than speculation.
Yeah, so on the post-tax numbers, so those include all forms of transfers, including the non-cash ones, counted at cost value as it is done in national accounts. So for the bottom 50%, post-tax, you don't see stagnation. From 1980, you see about a 20% rise, and a lot of that is actually due to the healthcare transfers, the Medicaid and the Medicare.
Emmanuel, in the chart you showed, the trajectory changed around 1980. And there are a whole host of, and by the way, I'm the only engineer in the room, so you've got 3 sociologists, 1 engineer. There are a whole host of macroeconomic data you look at that all seem to change in 1980. And I always immediately go back to the Fed. I'm biased because I work at the Fed. And usually, though, when you look at data that changes in 1980, and when I think maybe it's attributable to monetary policy, usually it manifests itself globally. So what you showed, it didn't manifest itself globally. It was unique to the U.S. But have you thought about it? Is there a story that the Fed's actions to control inflation, reduce inflation risk, pushes up asset prices over the long term, and that accrues to the owners of assets, which would be the wealthy individual? Does that story make sense, or have you thought about it that way?
Yeah, I mean, that relates to what was discussed this morning. It's true that inflation typically, is equalizing just because people cannot catch up, systematically with inflation. There is a lag, and so it benefits, debtors against creditors. So that maybe that played a role, but looking really at the US evidence, the UK evidence, and evidence from other countries, it really looks like the election of Ronald Reagan, and the policies that were carried out, mostly, a big decline in tax progressivity. Before Reagan, you had a top income tax rate of 70% and went down, to 28% by the end of the Reagan administration. Continuing financial deregulations and trying, as a government, to limit the power of unions and letting the minimum wage erode. I think this mix of policies likely played a big role, because you see the same thing in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, where you have a clear inflection point in '79, and countries who haven't gone, which haven't gone, through such a drastic policy transition, don't see, the same effect. So I really think, that those series show you that policy plays a very big role in shaping income inequality.
Fabrizio?
Yeah, Manuel, it's a great data that you present, but I want to go back to the France and US, because I thought it was very interesting. So those data is about how the pie is shared, but there's no sense of the size of the pie. And in some sense, you can say that for the past 20 years, US has seen a big increase in income inequality, but it's seen a more robust growth than other countries. And another thing I would like to think about migration. If you think about a migrant from Africa, and I think this is captured by most of people, where would you like to migrate? Most people would say the US. Despite the high income inequalities, also more opportunity relative. Even though opportunity may be going down, but maybe still higher than there was in France. So I was wondering what are your thoughts on that, and you're thinking about how you think to relate the inequality to the aggregate growth.
Yeah, no, so this is a good question. Yeah, so I didn't show you a chart that I had that in the US from 1980 to 2014, you have 60% growth of national income per adult. In France, during the same period, you only have about 40% income growth, in part because France, like many European countries, haven't grown at all since 2007. The Great Recession has been a disaster for Europe. Nevertheless, the bottom 50% in France has grown by about 40%, while it has stagnated in the US. So even though, yes, it's true, France has grown less, but the bottom 50% has shared in that growth in France. So on immigration, it's true that for immigration, at the top, for skilled people, yes, the US is the land of opportunity. Many of us in this room actually come from foreign countries, and it's true, to be an academic, there's no better country in the world than the United States. It's also interesting, so as this panel is about opportunity and mobility, so the US likes to think of itself as, the American dream, the land of opportunity. But in reality, if you look at intergenerational mobility today in the US, it's actually lower than it is in a number of European countries. That is, if you start poor in the United States, as a kid, you are more likely to grow up, and be poor yourself than it would be the case, for example, in Denmark or France.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a question for Phil, or Philip.
Yeah.
I was wondering what the implications are for your findings of the selection effects that are associated with the fact that kids who are in more selective colleges and universities typically come from more affluent families in the first place.
Yeah, that is a feature of these data. And what we know, for instance, is that there's an inverse relationship between selectivity of schools and the default rates with respect to, say, student debt outcomes, okay? So what I mean by that is that the more selective the school, the lower is the student default rate associated with that college or university. So if it's the case, and why might that be? Well, I think the intuition is pretty clear, that the more selective schools are drawing from a certain part of the population, and then the earnings prospects for the students who, even though they may acquire large amounts of debt, right? You go to one of these very expensive selective schools, you have a ton of debt. But because of the homes that you're coming from, and also because of the networks that you establish that Bill talked about earlier today, you are going to graduate from those institutions in a stronger position in terms of jobs and career outcomes to repay those loans. Whereas at schools that are less selective, it's the case that those networks are not going to be as robust. It's going to be the case that the students coming to those schools may be more challenged. And so as a result, the prospect of paying back any amount of debt that is taken on is less. And so when you think about the type of chart that I've shown you, it would be important to keep in mind that any type of public policies that help with student loan repayment and aggressive recruitment of students from different demographic groups going to more selective schools, that's going to help level out that chart such that it doesn't indicate, one, you get rid of some of the selection bias, but at the same time, it will indicate more mobility than what's currently there right now.
So a couple of people have touched on mobility or the lack of it in the U.S. And I guess one of my thoughts about mobility is that we all have this idea that we want to do. Well, I shouldn't say we all. Many of us have the idea we'd like to do better, we'd like to achieve, we'd like to move up in the distribution, say, of the U.S. Maybe most of us are at the top, so we're not really looking to move. But part of why we want that is we don't want our kids to be worse off. But if we increase mobility, that means that some of us have to have kids that are going to do worse off, because you cannot have mobility without movement up and down. And so places that are mobile is all the mobility at the bottom, that it just goes higher up the distribution, or how do we get out of this? We can't all do better and increase mobility. So
Depends on what's happening in the economy.
Well, I don't know if we all can do better. It has to do with absolute versus relative, right? So in an absolute sense, we can do better. But I guess the question there. Mobility is not about absolute. Excuse me? Mobility is about relative. I understand that, but you made the statement about us doing better, okay? And so better is, in an absolute sense, we can do better. And certainly, I don't think I or anybody else would advocate that we have to push people down in terms of, if we're thinking about relative positions in the income distribution, that's not really where we're coming from. But I think what we're looking for is a situation where we've created an environment where all of the students with potential to attain BA degrees have the opportunity to have the best career trajectory that they could possibly have. And I think from the perspective of public policy, we're looking to try to eliminate any obstacles. So for instance, if we know that for-profit colleges are teaching a narrow set of skills, and they are recruiting certain types of students that will be compromised once they've finished those schools, then I think it is appropriate for public policy to look at those schools carefully and say, okay, what's happening in these institutions in terms of the type of supports while they're in the institution and once they graduate, so that they don't get caught up in a cycle of debt, for instance. And I think those are the types of situations that public policy can do something about, so that they have an opportunity to move as far as they can up the income ladder.
Yeah, I mean, on that one, I'd like to say something. I fully agree with Philippe. But normatively, kids don't choose the families they are born in, so they are not responsible for the quality, or how high income their parents are, and therefore we don't want that to have to determine too strongly, the economic success of the kids. Now, that said, that if you give opportunities, to kids to go to the best schools, there will be, so the Harvards, the Stanfords, etc. There will be fewer slots, for the rich kids, let's say, and it's true that creates a conflict, that is, if we are at the top, we want our kids to succeed, and therefore any policy, that is going to bring, disadvantaged kids is, in competition. It might be resented, but it's still the case that normatively you can still think that's a good thing, even though, yes, it hurts the rich parents.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, one thing that's been alluded to in this discussion, but hasn't really been followed up too much more, is that once kids from disadvantaged backgrounds get to college, the dropout rates are extremely high. Not to mention, that's even when they go to regular colleges that aren't exploitative. And I guess I was wondering if there's any thought on how not only once we get the kids out of the high school, but get them not only into college, but what sort of interventions seem to be important in having them stay, and whether we may even have to think about a different set of institutions.
So it is true that disadvantaged kids overwhelmingly go to for-profit trade schools and community colleges. Some do go to four-year colleges. They tend to do better there than they would have if they had gone to these other institutions. Your point is correct, but the low-hanging fruit here is the exploitative schools that do not produce earnings gains commensurate with the debt they create and have low completion rates. And then our community colleges, Cheryl Hyman, who is one of really the gems in community college education, has been celebrated in Chicago, and rightly so, because she brought the on-time completion rate from 7 to 15%. So if there is one institution that we could focus on improving, in the higher ed spectrum for low-income kids, who often, by the way, don't want to go far from home because they're enmeshed in their networks, and they really do need to both support and be supported by their social networks. It would be making community colleges more competitive with for-profits, regulating for-profits so kids can be sure that they're getting quality, or at least casting a bright light on what the product actually is so kids can compare.
So yeah, on this one, I wanted to add something. So recently with Rash Chetty and his team, we've compiled statistics, college by college, on the distribution of parents, income distribution of parents and income distribution of kids. And so what we've noticed is that even within an area, like say the LA areas, there is tremendous heterogeneity in how good community colleges, public schools will be in moving kids, poor kids, towards, say, the top 20% of the distribution. So even, within that set of schools, there are things, that some schools do better than others. And the hope is that with such statistics, we'll learn better what are the characteristics so that, those good schools can expand,
Can I say one other thing about that? And that is that with respect to supporting kids in college, so one interpretation I have of your question is that, okay, what if we get some of the students who normally wouldn't attend certain schools into these schools, higher, more selective schools? And one thing that maybe people fail to appreciate is the enormous amount of resources that are brought to bear for the majority population in order to have high graduation rates at these schools, okay, of 70, 80, 90%. these kids get all types of support, okay? Which, when you bring in different groups of people, they also benefit from those same services. So sometimes it involves the expansion of services in order to make sure that disadvantaged kids do well. But sometimes it's just making sure within the institution already they know the different channels and networks through which they can use the resources that are already being provided on a significant scale, so that they benefit and graduate at the same rates as the majority population.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion, and we'll be back in 15 minutes at 3:45.
All right. Okay, I want to welcome everyone to the last panel of the day. Just a little housekeeping. At the end of this panel, we're going to have a 15-minute break. And just as a reminder, that's going to be followed by dinner and a keynote address. And the keynote speaker for the evening is Governor Lael Brainerd. And so we welcome everyone to stick around for that. And to start off our panel, we're going to start with Jeff Larimore. He is a senior economist in the Division of Consumer and Community Affairs at the Federal Reserve Board, and he's going to tell us about the Survey of Household and Economic Dynamics.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and certainly thank you for including me in this important institute's opening. I'm sort of excited to be here and be sharing with you information about the work that I'm doing at the Federal Reserve Board, which is on the Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making. And what I want to do today is talk about, first of all, just what is the SHED survey, because I recognize that this is a relatively new survey in terms of the data that the Federal Reserve is producing. Talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing with the data, where we see some potential questions that can be answered with it, and then also thinking about sort of this idea of what are the opportunities out there for us to partner with this institute and with other researchers, so where are some of the potential extensions that we can go with it. So first of all, just some background on the survey. So the SHED is an annual survey on financial well-being that the Federal Reserve has been conducting each fall since 2013. This is actually exciting timing for me in terms of this conference relative to our data, because we actually just on Friday came out with our latest report on financial well-being, which covers the results from our survey in the fall of 2016. So I actually even have some copies here if any of you are interested in having that as a takeaway from this conference. But what is the SHED? So the SHED is designed really with three primary motivations. The first one is to monitor trends in consumer behavior and sentiment, particularly among low and moderate income populations. And the way that we then actually sort of implement this motivation is, first of all, by having an oversample of low and moderate income individuals. So to make sure that we have a substantial representation to be able to answer the questions we want to look at, we do have an oversample of people making under $40,000 per year. But also in thinking about the questions and the way that we design what's actually being asked in the survey, really trying to focus on issues that are going to be most impacting this particular population. So for example, we have questions in the survey asking people who didn't complete a college education, what were some of the barriers that prevented you from completing that education? Looking at things such as people's economic fragility and their ability to handle relatively modest emergency expenses. So really trying to craft the question, craft the survey with that low and moderate income population in mind. The second motivation for the survey is to cast light on current issues in financial well-being. And here, as the survey is being designed, we actually try to reserve about 15 to 20% of the time in the survey each year to new modules and new questions that might be emerging and important for thinking about financial well-being. So a couple years ago, there was the first time, one of the early modules we did with this was looking at auto lending and thinking about what some of the issues are with car purchases and auto lending experiences. This year, we included questions thinking about the gig economy and people's experiences with informal labor markets, so Uber, Lyft, et cetera. And so really trying to make sure that we're actually able to be responsive to new issues as they're actually emerging relatively rapidly. And then the third piece is recognizing that we do have other great data sources throughout the Federal Reserve System, throughout the government and academia. So trying to really fill data gaps. So the SCF, which John's going to talk about, for example, has great information on wealth distributions. We're not trying to replicate that, but trying to really sort of fill some data gaps where there might not be other reliable data out there. So as I said, the most recent findings we just released on Friday. The data is not quite posted on the Federal Reserve's website, but it should be later this week. So we really are also trying to make sure that the data is open and available for researchers to use and answer questions that they're particularly interested in. Before talking a little bit about some of the things we've been doing with it, the other piece of background on this survey, because I think it is, and the session is talking about sort of emerging ways we're using data, and this is a data set that's fielded somewhat differently than other data sets. And that's because even though, so we're starting with a random address-based sampling through our partner in the survey, GfK's Knowledge Panel, but the actual administration of the survey is completely conducted online. So they actually go out, they do the random address-based sampling to then find people who are willing to take our survey and other surveys and then actually administer these online. Now we recognize that this both comes with its advantages and limitations. So one of the limitations we recognize, certainly thinking about opportunity and inclusive growth, is this question of, well, gee, is this really a representative sample of everyone or is it just people with computers? And that is addressed here by recognizing that not everyone does have a computer, so people who want to participate in the panel and are selected for it, but don't have a computer or internet, are then provided with it. The advantage, though, to us is that it does allow us easier ability to recontact people, follow up with them. So in constructing the actual sample, we have randomly selected fresh respondents each year in addition to our lower income oversample, but then also about a third of the population that we're interviewing each year are people who we interviewed in the previous round of the survey. So there is at least some element of panel component to it that we're able to then follow up with some of these people and see how well-being is tracking from one year to the next for some of the same individuals. As I said, this is a survey that really looks at a wide range of financial experiences and financial well-being. So just to give you a flavor of some of the topics that it covers, we include questions on overall economic well-being, on employment and the gig economy and informal labor markets, on income and savings behavior, banking and credit, economic preparedness, education, retirement savings. So really trying to cover a wide range of aspects of people's financial lives. So what are some of the things that we've actually been doing with this data? As I said, a lot of the things that we're looking at are really focused on the financial circumstances of people at the lower end of the income distribution. I think that if there's one question that people know from this survey, it's probably how would you handle a $400 emergency expense if it was to arrive, if you were to have one, and how you handle that. Something that we did that's new this year, but trying to get at a similar concept, is asking people, are you able to pay all of your current month's bills, or are you expecting to have to make a partial payment on some of them, or simply not pay some of them? So when we ask people this question, we see that a little under a quarter of people, 23%, tell us that they're not expecting to pay all their current month's bills in full. But then we had this follow-up question. And we asked the follow-up question is, suppose you had a $400 emergency expense. How would that now impact your ability to pay? And through the combination of these two questions, we think we're now able to get this sense of people who are either living near the edge financially, so a relatively modest emergency expense would be a setback for them, or they're already living over the edge financially and they can't even pay their current month's bills. And so when we look at these two questions combined, we end up with 35% of people telling us that they wouldn't expect to be able to pay all their current month's bills if they had this $400 emergency expense. What we can then look at is breaking this down based on people's education and based on the race and ethnicity. And here we start to see the big differences in people's preparedness for these relatively modest emergencies based on their education and based on race and ethnicity. And even looking at race and ethnicity within education groups. So this is the fraction who, with that sort of the fuller set, saying that they would still be able to handle that pay all their current month's bills, even if they had a $400 emergency expense they also had to pay. And we see that as people's education increases, we see an increase in the fraction who say that they'd be able to handle this sort of an emergency. But we also then see, as I said, within each of the education groups that white non-Hispanics are more likely than black non-Hispanics or Hispanics to say that they'd be able to handle these sorts of expenses. Another type of thing that we look at is, which was really inspired this year in terms of new issues that we incorporated into the survey this year, really inspired by conversations thinking about with Matt Desmond, thinking about his book Evicted, is what the experiences are of people who are renters, and particularly thinking of renters who are lower in the income distribution. And so we have some questions about the rental challenges by, we have some questions about eviction in there and whether people experienced eviction, but we also have questions asking them about their experiences with their landlord, and being able to get, the way that we're conceptualizing this and thinking about it is their ability to get problems with their rental unit fixed should they arise. And so we asked people, did you have any problems that you needed to have, that you felt needed to be fixed with your apartment or your house? Did you contact your landlord about them? And then this is now among people who contacted their landlord, what sort of challenges they had actually getting that problem resolved. And we don't actually see substantial differences by race and ethnicity in their likelihood of having problems or then contacting their landlord, but where we do see the big difference is is looking at their ability to get the problem fixed with just a little bit of difficulty or no difficulty. So whites are much less likely to say they had substantial or moderate difficulty getting their landlord to address these problems. And we actually can, we know in the survey the type of housing unit, we know the rent that they're paying, we also know things about their income and the various personal characteristics, and we still see these differences even when we control for all those other factors. So I think that this survey, these sorts of things that we're actually looking at with the survey that we think can be really useful as we think about some of the challenges among low and moderate income individuals. What are some of the potential questions that we think could be answered that we haven't been looking at yet? So one of the things that is particularly advantageous with this survey is that we have a lot of detailed information about higher education, including the actual school attended. And so we can see in the data that you do have these big differences, not just in the likelihood of people going to college based on their family backgrounds, but also in the types of schools that they went to. So this can then potentially provide us additional insights into these questions of what the impacts of the types of schools that people went to are, and really trying to build off of some of the work that Philip was talking about, some of the work of Adam Looney and Konstantin Nellis that looks at differences by the actual schools people went to, and really try to tease out some of these additional details on how the type of school people went to then plays into these additional roles, additional outcomes, even among people who actually went and completed a degree. A second type of thing that we could be looking at is what's contributing to people going into the gig economy. So as I said, we have these new questions this year looking at people's participation in informal labor markets. So how do people's financial circumstances and family backgrounds impact the likelihood of participating in these markets? What are some of the circumstances that might lead people into it? To what extent are they doing it because they're needing to smooth income losses from other sources? To what extent is it a choice that they want the additional flexibility? And also, should we be thinking about it as sort of a large single market, or are there differences in people who are participating in Uber and Lyft and that sort of market versus Airbnb and sort of renting out your capital and your property that you have? Or people who are in the offline markets and people who might have been previously doing this, but we just weren't really paying attention to it before these new markets started to emerge. And then a third sort of potential new question, just sort of trying to sort of spur thoughts about this data and things that we're able to look at, is this question of what's the relationship between family background, and various well-being metrics. So we have information on parents' education. We ask about various things that you might have worried about as a child. So to what extent did you worry about food, having enough food to eat, having a stable family and stable caregivers, your personal safety, your family's finances, and how does that now relate to what people's outcomes are as adults? And we also have information in the restricted use version about the city and zip code where people actually went to high school to be able to get some of that geographic information as well. So finally, in sort of the last minute that I have, a couple of potential areas where I think there's potential for data enhancements, but would certainly welcome follow-up and questions and discussion about this. So because we're able to recontact people, it's possible to do focus groups and sort of deeper dives into particular topics of interest with subsets of respondents using this survey as a screening mechanism. As I said, we don't have detailed financial information as seen in the SCF or the CPS. We certainly don't want to compete with and overlap with that sort of product, but in the other surveys. But to the extent that there is value in being able to have some of that information in the context of other questions asked in the shed, were there potential areas for there? We know that it's completely self-reported. We don't have administrative links to separately verify financial information. Again, to the extent that it's possible, are there certain administrative data that we should be trying to investigate and explore linking in? And then also using the flexibility that we have in the survey, are there certain areas that you as researchers say, this would be really valuable to be able to have in a nationally representative data set? So some of the things that we're at least talking about are CFPB now has their new financial well-being scale to systematically track well-being for demographic groups over time. So that would be something that we could consider trying to add in an additional systematic dimension to this. How people are valuing their community amenities and thinking about community development activities. Adding information about financial knowledge and financial literacy, so things like the Anna Maria Lusardi questions. But then also just sort of, are there other topics of interest that, as I said, you as researchers say, this would be really valuable for us to be able to know more about, because that's something that we are actively interested in hearing about and knowing what the research questions are that you really think would be important to know more about. And so with that, I will pass it on and look forward to discussion and questions.
Okay, we're now going to hear from John Sabelhouse. He's an assistant director in the Division of Research and Statistics at the Federal Reserve Board, and he's going to talk to us about the Survey of Consumer Finance.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this group. There's three of us talking about Fed data, and it's just a testament to what the Fed, I think, does on this front. There's in terms of testaments also, there's a lot of names on this slide right here. These are the people who are right now wrapping up the 2016 SCF, and I just want to thank all of them as I get moving. Okay, so what am I going to do? What is the SCF and how is the survey changing for 2016 and beyond? You just heard about SHED, which is very young and nimble. The SCF is a little bit older and slower, but you'll see we actually went through a redesign before this latest wave, and I'll be able to share some of that with you. I want to talk about using the SCF for studying the questions at hand today. And then some open questions that we could actually move on to for using the SCF. Finally, thinking about ways we can improve the SCF for studying inequality, opportunity, and inclusion, including access to the non-public SCF and the linkages to administrative data. So what is the SCF? So the SCF is a household survey with comprehensive balance sheets, incomes, demographics, work histories, and attitudes. Most people think of it as a wealth survey, and it is at its core. It is one of the primary micro-wealth surveys in the U.S., but it also has a lot of other features as well, which play into part of what I'm going to talk about. It is a cross-section survey, triennial. It goes back to 1983, but in its modern form, it goes back to 1989, or in its consistent form, I should say. There's a lot of things you can do that go back to 83, but certainly you can answer questions that are common to all the surveys from 89 forward. The SCF is well known for oversampling high-wealth families using administrative data derived from tax returns. This is what I'll refer to later as the sampling data. This is what allows us to know that we're actually talking to the entire distribution of families. We're not truncated at the top. Emmanuel mentioned earlier, one of the big problems with most surveys is they are truncated at the top. It's very difficult to reach and talk to high-income families, and that's part of what the SCF specializes in. And one of the other things a lot of people don't know about the SCF is that there's a very distinct trade-off between sample size and data quality. So in a relative sense, the SCF is fairly small compared to the survey, the current population survey, the American Community Survey, lots of other big public data sets. But every case that we see gets a very extensive case review based on interviewer notes. There's a facility for them to take notes while they're doing the interview. There's the sampling data itself, and then internal consistency within the case. And a lot of that review process bears on the sorts of things that we're talking about. So let me just talk about this data quality a little bit more. So the samples are fairly small at around 6,000 households. So it is actually possible to thoroughly review every case, and that's what that group of people in the first slide have been doing for the past year. Every case gets a read that could be as short as 15 minutes, but it could be as long as an hour, where we're trying to reconcile and think about what's happening. And I think the title of Catherine's book was Making Ends Meet. A lot of times we're asking the question, how do people make ends meet? So for a wealthy business owner, this might involve focusing on how the reported wealth that they're telling us about and the reported incomes line up with or are consistent with the reported income on the sampling data. So we have their underlying tax data that tells us that they're probably rich, but trying to understand, and we can look back a few years and try to understand how rich they are is something which we'll go through a lot of storytelling and trying to figure out exactly what's happening with them. At the same time, we're also interested in the population we've been talking about all day, which is for low-income households, we'll focus on how their reported incomes, including transfers, line up with their reported spending, because we have some data on the rent they pay, the food they buy, and things like that. And so, again, a lot of it is about storytelling and thinking about how people make ends meet, and every one of these cases is going to get a very thorough review. So is the SCF just about the rich? So part of what I think people hear the SCF and they say, oh, that's the survey that covers the rich. And it does. The top 1% of the population is represented by about 10% of the cases in the SCF. So we're definitely oversampled in that direction, the same sense Jeff pointed out, shed oversamples in the other direction. But there are several questions in the survey that are focused mostly on the finances of low and moderate income families. So, for example, we ask about financial support from others, we ask about loan payment status and bankruptcy history, and we ask about whether spending exceeded income and the use of payday loans. So these sort of regular features, things that we worry about in the finances of low and moderate income families, are things we ask about. And more importantly, there's an increasing focus going forward on the financial environment and decisions confronting what I'll call the non-rich. And this is the redesign process we went through after 2013. So a lot of people who are regular SCF users will have these new questions that you can deal with. We'll be releasing the data for 2016 in a couple of months. And for example, we have an improved credit demand and supply module. And this is where we actually borrowed from our friends. We'll talk to you in a few moments about the survey of consumer expectations, where they had a wonderful credit demand and supply module, and we implemented that directly. We also, with some of our other Fed colleagues at the Boston Fed in the survey of consumer payment choice, started talking to them about, when you're thinking about how people pay for things versus how much money they have, how much money is, what their cash flow is, not getting it right, how they're paying for things can actually really bias the survey. So we put in tracking of prepaid debit cards, which are becoming a much more prominent feature in finances of low and moderate income families. An expanded student loan module. We've heard a lot about education and the role of education and the cost of education, the cost of student loans. We asked some more detail about those loans. Another interesting set of questions, and again, Jeff was talking a little bit about what they do in SHED. We had one that's sort of similar, which is a prospective response to financial shocks. How would you react if something happened? And because at this point in the survey, we've already asked about their assets and liabilities, we know we can give them a list of things. If they tell us they're going to sell assets, we know whether or not they have assets, and the survey itself can adjust for those potential inconsistencies. We added questions about foreclosures that have been initiated in the current status. We added the financial literacy questions, the Anna Maria Lusardi, the big three, and an expanded retirement account tracking. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then finally, one which I think is really, again, from a mobility perspective, one that I think we're really glad we made it on there, and we had really good response on this one, is asking people about their parents' educational attainment as well as their own. We now ask about their parents. There's a lot to look forward here in the survey in a couple of months. So now I want to talk a little bit about the SCF research and how it relates to what we've been talking about here today and in this conference. So there's a lot of attention that the SCF gets. It's focused on what I'll call the top shares literature. So Emmanuel was showing us some of this earlier, talking about what they've done in terms of Piketty-Saez and Saez-Zuckman, top income and wealth shares. What share does the top 1% have, the top 10% have? And we actually have contributed to that literature as well. We have a paper in Brookings last year using the SCF that compares and contrasts with some of the measures based on just tax data. And we actually find that the increases, although we find the top shares rising, they're not nearly as dramatic. It's about half as much at the very top as you get from tax data alone. And I would invite you to read that, and you could think about why these differences emerge. But the other thing that the SCF has been used for, and my colleagues Jeff Thompson and Gustavo Suarez have used it for studying determinants of wealth by race and ethnicity, and thinking about what is it that's led to the big disparities in wealth. Wealth disparities by race have been even more pronounced, have gotten even more pronounced than income disparities by race. There is other research that we've done that's focused on home ownership, debt, spending, retirement preparedness for especially the bottom half of the income distribution. And in these sorts of papers, we can do things like when people tell stories about the Great Recession, and they talk about families taking on a lot of debt, especially Mian and Sufi, for example, low-income households taking on debt that they ultimately couldn't repay, that what we actually see was there was an explosion of debt across the distribution. And we know this because we can use the SCF, we can look across the entire distribution. One other thing on the retirement preparedness, we can use our data because we really have comprehensive measures of retirement. We have your DC accounts, your 401ks and IRAs, but we also have your DB pensions, and we can allocate that across households. And we could actually look at expected Social Security benefits, not what the respondents report, but what we can infer based on their own work histories. And you see things like, for example, the retirement industry will tell us that everything is fine because the ratio of retirement assets to income is actually stable. Well, that's not fine in an aging population. It should be going up. It shouldn't just be stable. And then more importantly, we can take our data, sort by our measure of permanent income, and we see that the retirement preparedness for the bottom half of the distribution has gotten much worse if we look at just private retirement assets, and you actually really see the role of Social Security in that. In terms of supporting retirement prospects. The SCF, the way we do these sorts of things, it's consistent with a pseudo panel analysis where everyone is a cross-section, but we can track various outcomes by birth cohort, race, education, and permanent income across the waves, and that's how we can do these kinds of studies. So what are some open questions? So I'll just throw a few up here real quick. Home ownership we have a huge drop in the home ownership rate in the U.S., and it's captured in the SCF through 2013. I suspect we'll track as well for 2016. And the question is this because of a drop in demand for home ownership, because people have diminished income expectations, or is it something that the Fed is doing? Is it something the Fed or other regulators in terms of making it so credit restrictions or limiting access to home ownership? And if that's part of the issue, can we tell using our data with this comprehensive balance sheet and income what's going on? Education. So we've done a lot of work in the past on student loans about whether or not what's the trade-off between taking on the additional debt and increasing the income, because we can see both things. But we also can ask questions about whether there are barriers to access by race, ethnicity, and income, and what sort of changes like income-based repayment might be called for. And finally, one I think that is getting a lot of attention now and probably deserves even more attention is what is the role of things like home equity in terms of starting new businesses. So our colleagues in elsewhere on the board, what we would call the real side of the board, talk about the lack of business dynamism, the lack of new business formation. And the question is, what is it that's holding that back? Is it like home ownership in the sense that it could be credit restrictions? And if so, there may be policy answers. That wasn't it. I do have a couple more. So one is, and Emmanuel set this up very nicely, right, which is the distributional national accounts literature, which he has initiated, and I think it's getting a lot of attention. So people at Census are involved, and we're getting very involved now. It's a project that goes across sections. We have the micro data. We also, our colleagues in the flow of funds section have the financial accounts data to distribute. But the question is, how can the SCF play its role of being this micro-level nexus between income, wealth, and spending, and really allow us to answer questions about how the distribution of production is actually changing over time? For example, when Janet was talking about the Medicaid expansions, we actually have, in addition to all our other data, we have, do you have health insurance through these various sources? So we can allocate that health insurance to the appropriate families. And build up these distributional accounts from a more micro basis rather than trying to piece together the distributions from different data sets. So the other one, which I'm really excited about, is what I'll call broader wealth concepts and sort of the value of social insurance. So we pay a lot more today for public health retirement programs. Most people don't know this, but Social Security is roughly double the size it was in the early 1970s in terms of replacement rates and in terms of taxes. It's gotten a lot bigger. And we're subtracting those taxes. Those are coming out of our income. It means income is not growing as fast, but we also get a lot more back in terms of benefits than, say, our grandparents' generation, not our parents' generation, but our grandparents' generation. And what that means, if you take the present value of Social Security benefits that are owed to people who've already started paying taxes, it's roughly $60 billion. Or $60 trillion. All household sector net worth is only about $80 trillion. So it's an amazing amount of wealth that we're not counting. But with the SCF, because we have these earnings histories, there's a group in our section who's working on trying to create these present value wealth concepts to think about getting better measures of how wealth distribution is actually changing. So what can we do to enhance the SCF? So there's a few real quick ideas that have been floated around over the years. More sample size is one. I hope I convinced you at the beginning that the attention that goes into the data set actually does limit us to some extent. It's actually a pretty expensive data set to collect, but also to process. Adding a panel dimension has been considered, and it's been tried on a couple of occasions. The distinctive nature of the SCF is because of the way we use the sampling data to get the top makes this difficult as well, and it's also, the attrition in panels can be bad. If you have a small sample to begin with, it can really amplify that. So it's led us to really focus our attention on improving the cross sections. However, we are very likely to adopt an online survey component, and my colleagues here at the table are part of why that's true. That the SC, the SHED, and the SCPC, again, that's the Boston Fed's survey, are all done online, and it may make this feasible. Data access and linkage, this is when we're often asked the question what can we do with the SCF? Can we link it to other data? And the SCF is a pioneer in linking surveys and administrative data because the admin is used to really select and actually validate the high wealth sample. Or because of that, though, our memorandum of understanding with IRS says no additional linking that could lead to any kind of disclosure. And it leads me to ask a question, and it actually came up at lunch today when we were talking about how to use the administrative data to do things. And if you think about the SCF is a survey of people drawn from an administrative data set. And that to me is the future. And that's one that, we think about how to enhance our data sets, being able to start with data that already has a lot of what you want to know, and then you add those extra questions that you can't get from administrative data. In many ways, that's what the SCF already is. And so there are a couple different things we have going on. I'm out of time, and if you want to talk to somebody about these projects, the section is open to working with people on the outside. But a couple things we're doing is linking to local area geography, and then working with statistical matching. We can't do actual matching, but we can find like households in these other data sets, two of which Wilbert is about to talk about. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Okay, Wilbert Vanderklau, he's a senior vice president in the microeconomic studies function at the New York Fed, and he's going to tell us about the New York Fed's survey of consumer expectations and the consumer credit panel. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk about two major data collections that we do. Which are the Survey of Consumer Expectations and the New York Fed Consumer Credit Panel. So I'm going to give a short description of both of these data collection efforts, give some examples of the research we've been doing that relate to the issue at hand here around inequality and opportunity, then talk about data access, data linkages, and potential enhancements to the data. So what's the Survey of Consumer Expectations? Well, it's a relatively new survey. It's started in 2013, focusing on expectations using frontier methodology from economics, psychology, and survey design. Why do we collect expectations data? Well, first is to able to monitor people's expectations, for example, about inflation, expected wage growth, and I'll talk about a number of other variables that we're looking at. So that's obviously very useful for monetary policy. We're also trying to understand better the link between expectations and behavior. So that will allow us not only to better understand why people make the choices they're making, but also makes it easier for us to forecast what people will be doing in the future. We try to understand better by tracking people's expectations over time. The same people, we can see how they revise expectations, so we can see how they actually form expectations. So that might allow us to move away from more traditional rational expectations model to the extent that people act differently. And finally, the survey will allow us to collect evidence on some other time-sensitive topics of interest, and I'll discuss some of them. So again, in summary, the data is very useful for monetary policy, but also it gives a basis for a body of academic research on a topic that economists actually know very little about: expectations, how people form expectations, and they're very important. So the main features of the data: it's monthly data, and collected since June 2013. It's a national representative sample. It's a rotating panel, so people move in and out of the survey. They stay in for 12 months, up to 12 months. So each month, one small portion rotates out and others come in. The core module has expectations about the economy and as well as the household. So it's inflation, unemployment, wage growth, home price appreciation, different types of expenditures, household income, taxes, government debt, government policies. There's a big range of questions on credit access and labor market transitions. And for many of them, we don't just collect a point forecast, what people expect to happen. We also look at the forecast distribution. We want to know their uncertainty they have about these expectations. Then on either 3 times a year or once a year, we have special models on special topics. So they kind of rotate on a quarterly basis. So there's credit access, labor market, the housing market, spending and savings, informal employment, family leave, student loans. So these are kind of some of the special topics that occasionally we want to ask questions about, and also these surveys will have some randomized experiments that we use for research. These are information experiments where we provide information to people and see how they update their expectations, and some other problem-solving experiments to see how people actually make choices. So while it's a relatively small sample, it's very rich data, right? We follow the same people over time. We see how they change their views, which is very useful. So you can split it by gender, race, ethnicity, age, education, income. So a lot of demographic variables, as well as a numeracy and financial literacy test that that all the participants complete. So I'll give you three examples that speak to the issue here about inequality and opportunity. And so the first one is about job finding expectations, and I show the patterns over time that we're collecting by education. We looked at what happened during the elections. There was a big increase in confidence. For example, the Michigan survey, we looked at heterogeneity, about what was going on. And then another example is credit access, where we study people's credit applications. Did they apply for any credit over the past year? Were they accepted or not? And were there people who didn't apply because they thought they would be rejected? So we call them the so-called discouraged borrowers, which is not available from any other data that we have on the credit markets. So these are patterns of job finding expectations. So the question here is, if you were to lose your job in the next, lose your job, what's the probability that you will be able to find a job in the next 3 months? And so that's the mean of the answers that people provide. And as you see, there's been an increasing trend during this period for all education groups, but the biggest increase was really for those with high school or less than high school education. And we have these trends, as you see under the demographics bar. These are interactive charts, and you can split it by age, education, income, numeracy, region, and of course with the raw data you can split it any other way that you would like. So this is when we looked at the same people, right? We interview them every month, and so we looked at the consumer sentiment. This is a question about whether they expect to be financially better off over the next year. And we looked at how people changed their mind after the elections. And then we split everybody in the sample by where they live and whether their county voted Democrats or GOP, or whether they flipped during the elections. And so what we see here, there was actually a lot of heterogeneity. So overall, there was an increase in confidence that shows up in the kind of Michigan survey. It also shows up in stock market expectations, where again you see a little bit an asymmetry. But what you see here is that in the counties where that voted Democrats, you see actually a decline in terms of this measure of confidence, and a big boost that was really coming out of the more Republican areas.
What does flipped mean?
I'm sorry?
What does flipped mean?
Flipped, well, they used to vote Democrat and they went to Republican, or the other way around, sorry. So they basically, from the previous general election, they switched. This is from our credit access module. And so again, here we ask people, did you apply for credit? And were you successful? The green bars are people who applied and were successful. The red section is people who applied and got rejected. This is for any kinds of credit, but we also split this by credit cards, auto loans, and mortgages and mortgage refinancing. And so what you see here, and then we split it into 3 groups by their credit scores. And so what you see is that for those with high credit scores, vast majority of applications are accepted. For the middle credit score group, you see a little bit more rejections. And then on the left, people with lower credit scores, high rejection rates, but also the blue sections are a high proportion of people who say they need credit, but they didn't apply because they expected to be rejected. So we report monthly releases from this survey online, and we have press briefings press releases every month. The microdata are released to the public and they're used for research and after initial embargo period. Currently, we have no data linkages. We were exploring linking the SC to credit report records. Now, we're very open to new questions, and we do get questions from other colleagues in the system as well as academic researchers, and we've been trying to be quite responsive to that. We would like to increase the sample size. Currently, it's about 1,300. We also would like to include spouses in the survey, and as was mentioned earlier, family context matters. We want to know how inter-household decisions are made, and for that you really need to get the views of spouses and partners. Okay, now turning to the second data collection, that's the consumer credit panel. I think many of you might have heard about this, but it's a quarterly panel of individuals and households. This data is based on Equifax credit reports. We started designing this just after the financial crisis. I wish we had this, before, of course. But so what we have is what is typically on credit reports, right? We have mortgages, home equity lines of credit, auto loans, credit cards, student loans. And so for each individual, we have aggregates for that, as well as for certain loan types, we have each individual loan. And so you can look at individuals over time, you could look at loans over time, and we have this data going back to 99. We have public record information, so that has foreclosures, bankruptcies, tax liens, and individual characteristics, not so much, right? There's not much on the credit report. I mean, we know people's age, we know their credit score, which is a good proxy for income, household composition, and where they live. So that's important. We know their state, their zip code, and even their census block. Okay, so the sample design, we have a 5% representative sample of individuals with a credit report, which after age 18, 19, it gets, you get very quickly to very high in the 90s. So that's 13 million individuals. So this is big data, right? So these are very rich, detailed data on 13 million people. Then we pull the credit reports of everybody else living at the same address. So we can look at the household. So that makes the sample 47 million individuals. And that information is updated every quarter. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it started in 99 and it's still ongoing. So what's really unique is about the sample design, the way we pull people, is that we pull the same people over time. So we have a panel, and it remains representative. So as people take out their first loan, they enter the panel. If they're immigrants, they come in and they take out their first loan, they enter the panel. And when people die, or when they emigrate, they leave the panel. So at each point in time, it is representative, so you can aggregate up and compare to national statistics. And of course, besides knowing all their debts, we also know their status on these debts, their delinquencies, and so on. So there's a lot of uses of these data. Financial behavior, entry into home ownership, household formation, because we see who they live with, home equity extraction. We've done a lot of reports on subprime auto and credit card originations and delinquencies. Geographic mobility, your credit report goes with you wherever you go, so there is no attrition, so you can see where people move. And we looked at the impact of natural disasters like Katrina and Sandy. We also recently used it to look at Puerto Rico, which is in our district, to look at the problems there. Okay, so it's a huge sample, very rich longitudinal information, few demographic variables, so there's no gender, race, and so on, and there's no income, although we have credit score. But because of the great geographic information, going all the way down to the census block, you could match it to statistics at the geographic level, and that's what we've been doing. So 3 examples. Shifts in mortgage borrowing by credit score. So this is really about the tightening of credit in the mortgage space. Then we looked at what's going on in oil-producing countries after counties within the U.S. after oil price collapsed, and then student debts. So this is the distribution of credit scores of newly originated mortgages. And so the 10th percentile is the lowest one shown here. So So what we see now is that only of all or newly originated mortgages, only 10% are for people who have credit scores lower than 650. And in 2006, that was almost 25% who had credit scores below that. So there was huge tightening, and as you see during the recession, the whole distribution moved up, and it stayed kind of up there. It really hasn't really come down, so there's still conditions are very tight for people with low credit scores. This is where we compared mortgage delinquency rates. These are 90 days delinquency rates for the US, which is the light blue line here. So you see this huge increase in delinquencies after the financial crisis and the recession. It's been coming down steadily, and then you see the same for oil producing countries. So here we looked at the proportion of employment in a county involved in mining and gas and oil extraction. And so those with a relatively high proportion are in that dark blue line. So there are more rural countries that in the past they used to have higher delinquency rates. They didn't have much of a boom bust. So there was an increase in delinquencies during the recession. And then it flattened out after 2014 when oil prices started going down. It kind of flattened out. So now they're actually coming together. When you look at auto loan delinquencies, they're actually very similar in these oil-producing countries compared to the rest of the US. But then after 2014, you see an increase in delinquencies for auto loans for these oil-producing countries. So this is some early signs of stress in these areas. The final example is student loan delinquencies. So what we do here is we look at 3 cohorts, and we look at 5 year after people leave college. We look at their status of the student loans that they took out. Okay, and we're going to look at what proportion of those are delinquent. That's the blue bars. Are in default. There's the blue bars. The red bars are delinquent. They haven't defaulted yet, but they're more than 120 days late. And the green bars are the proportion of people who haven't paid back anything. So their debt has been sitting there, probably growing because of interest accumulation. They might be in income-based repayment programs and not making any payments. So what this is showing is, first of all, that 2009 is by far the worst cohort. And so very, very high delinquency rates. And then on the horizontal axis, we now divide all the borrowers by the average income in the area, the zip code that they live. And so what we see here is that the highest delinquency rates are in the lower income areas, and delinquency rates and default rates are really spectacularly high. And we've looked further at this problem, and part of it is dropout, part of it is the schools they went to. So a lot of them do go to these for-profits, and that's why we get very, very high delinquency rates for people who went to for-profits. Community colleges actually also have very high delinquency rates. And the dropout rate, of course, is a big problem. So we have data releases every quarter. We released our last report last week. It got a lot of attention again because we crossed the total debt balance that we had in 2008. Last, it was the kind of peak level. Now we cannot post the microdata. The vendor doesn't allow us to share that, but we put as much data out as we can. So national, state, county statistics are used a lot in research. Within the system, everybody can use the microdata as well as co-authors that can share the data. There are already over 150 research papers, policy briefs, and academic journal articles. It's kind of exploding how many papers use these data. Links. Okay, well, there's been a lot of efforts to link these data with other data sets. Some of the results I was just describing about splitting it by college, we also split it by college major and so on, comes from matches that we did with National Student Clearinghouse data. We also matched the data with for students who went to the CUNY system, and all the students in West Virginia, their transcripts data were linked as well. Then there are a lot of matches with mortgage type data from loan performance, LPS, HMDA. HMDA has the race of the applicant, and so there's work on that where You can look at how the credit tightening differentially affected minorities. And Neil Buddha has also linked the data with payday loan applicant data. So there are a lot of linkages already. We hope to link it to earnings records, because then we can really look at unemployment shocks and look what happens with people, and also link it with small business owner data. That's it.
Okay, our last panelist is Rob Morin. He is the director of the Minnesota Population Center, and he's going to talk to us about his ambitious IPUMS project.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's IPUMS. Let's all say it together. IPUMS. Welcome to Minnesota, for those of you who are from out of town. Help here, just forward. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about, we're going to change gears. I'm going to talk about something a little different. I'm going to talk about the past, present, and future of microdata for research on social inequality and for opportunity and inclusive growth. The focus is going to mostly be on the IPUMS collection, but also on other Minnesota Population Center related data collections, but I'll touch on some broader things. I'm not entirely sure what you all know. I suspect that many people know some things, but not everybody's going to know everything that I said, so hopefully everyone can take away something. And I'm not going to show any results. I was fascinated by the results on the last talks, but I don't have any results for you. I'm going to let you, at the end, though, imagine your own research, and then you can also imagine results, if you like. So I'm going to talk about the past, the present, and the future. In talking about the past, I'm going to talk about integrating historical microdata, and I'll tell you why that's useful. When I talk about the present, I'm going to talk about the IPUMS CPS collection, the Current Population Survey collection. And when I talk about the future, I'm going to talk about ongoing record linkage initiatives at Minnesota, but also around the country, and how those things are connected. That's very much future-oriented. So let's start with the past. When I was in graduate school, and probably when many of you were in graduate school, this is how you found data, right? The data were described usually in binders, the code books, and you had a different one for each data set, and there was zero effort or ability to compare them. So here is a page from the 1900 US Census. It's the variable describing people's relationship to their head of household. And in 1900, there was one variable that described that, and it had 72 different categories. In 1980, there were only 20 categories, but it was in 2 variables. If you were to try to reconcile those two, to study trends between 1900 and 1980, most of the time of your research would be in trying to construct that variable. That's what IPUMS is, of course. This is the IPUMS, you can't read that, you don't need to. This is the IPUMS variable describing people's relationship to their head of household in every census from 1850 to 2000, and then also in the American Community Survey every year. It's done for you, you don't have to do it anymore, which should facilitate a lot of research. We have census microdata for every census from 1850 to 2000, 1890 burned up in a fire, and 2010 and 2020 there was no long form. And before 1850 it was largely a household survey. There wasn't individual level data. In recent decades, since 1960, that's just reiterating what I showed you a minute ago, we have census microdata from 1960 to 2000. The IPUMS collection, the IPUMS USA collection also includes the American Community Survey every year from 2000 to 2016, and the Current Population Survey from very early on, also to 2016. This is just the US, though. IPUMS actually has a large international collection. The blue countries are countries for which we have obtained census data, usually in multiple census years, and integrated them with the IPUMS USA collection. So this is the how are you related to the head of household variable across 23 African countries in the most recent census for which we have data. It's fully integrated with the US data. Right now there are 89 countries so far. We have people traveling the world, negotiating with international census bureaus. 336 samples, so about 4 censuses for most countries, ranging from the year 1701 to the present. But these are just censuses. I said a little bit about things that are not censuses, the American Community Survey and the Current Population Survey. IPMS now also includes other data products that you probably want to know about. One is the demographic and health surveys, which is one of the main ways that we know about the health and well-being of women and children, childbirth outcomes, and things like that in developing countries. The IPMS collection now includes India and 20 African countries. Again, measures harmonized across samples and over time. We generally have 3 or 4 DHS surveys for each of these countries, and we're expanding as quickly as we can. IPMS also includes a population and environmental data collection. Here, the goal is to integrate population data, such as the censuses, with land use data, land cover data, and climate and environmental variables, such that they are fully interoperable. You don't need to figure out how to match them. Often at very low resolution geographically, and comparable, of course, over time and place. This is the full IPMS collection. I haven't said anything about the higher education surveys or the time use surveys. Those are also interesting, but perhaps of less interest to this audience. This is how much microdata there are now in the collection. We have about 3.5 billion person records, we have a little over 3 billion now. We're headed to 3.5 billion person records, all freely available, all well documented on the internet. We have about 147,000 users. We distribute about 3.6 terabytes of data per week. And the IPMS collections, one data set or another, are cited about 2,000 times a year, which is a new paper about every 4 hours, including at night. So that's the past. That's less interesting. Let me talk about a current product, a recent product that you probably should know about or you should tell your colleagues about. And this is the IPMS Current Population Survey collection. I'm sure all of you are familiar basically with the Current Population Survey. It's a sample of civilian household-based individuals. Every month there's about 140,000 people in the survey and about 70,000 households. The basic survey every month includes information about labor force behaviors and basic demographic information. And of course, there are supplements in almost every month on things like education or food security or civic engagement and so forth. And then the supplement that gets used the most is the annual social and economic supplement, which has detailed information about income, poverty, and other social and economic characteristics. You know the basic design probably. If your household is selected to be in the Current Population Survey, say in January, your first month in the survey is in January. You're then re-interviewed every month for 3 months. You're left alone for 8 months, and then your 5th through 8 months in the survey are in the same 4 calendar months in the following year. So it's a 16-month longitudinal survey, but where you're just left alone for the middle 8 months. And then, of course, another panel comes in every month, and so forth. Most people use the CPS as a cross-sectional survey. So you could compare the United States in January of a year to the United States in February of a year. This is where, unemployment rates, essentially you're doing repeated cross-sectional analysis of current population survey data. Some people compare across years, perhaps most often with the annual social and economic supplement, the ASEC. People will compare from March to March, although it's technically not always March. A difficult thing about doing this kind of analysis historically has been to do a March to March comparison. You have to go get both March surveys, and you have to read the documentation and figure out how the data changed across the 2 Marches, and that can be tricky. We have taken care of that for you. Does anybody recognize this webpage? Anybody? Yeah. I love this webpage. I used it for many, many years, and I don't use it anymore. It's the NBER website where you can get CPS supplements and the documentation, and it's really impressive in how much is there. But it's really hard to use. Not because of the website design, but because what you're really getting are PDF files of the raw documentation, which you then have to work to sort through to try to figure out how to code each variable. It's a wonderful resource, but I think its time has come. The other place you might have gone would be the Unicon utilities. I had to go to a historical website archiving service to get this. It doesn't exist anymore. So no longer do we have the Unicon CPS utilities, which is where IPMS CPS comes in. We've integrated and fully harmonized and well documented and produced for free for people to download CPS files The basic monthly survey is from January 1976 through the most recently released basic monthly survey in March of this year. The ASEC supplements from 1976 forward, and we're working backwards as well. Again, where all the variables are measured consistently over time, recoded, with good documentation about changes in question wording and universe and all of that, but meant to make analyses over time vastly easier. We've also treated many other supplements in this way. The ASEC, I think, is of most interest to this group, but we've also done this to most of the most commonly used supplements. And we're doing them in the order with which they are used. So we're trying to do the most commonly used supplements first. So none of that said anything about the longitudinal capacity of IPM. So remember, it's a 16-month longitudinal survey. And what that means is that in any particular, if you were to do a March-to-March comparison, you have 4 rotation groups that were interviewed twice. That's complicated. It gets hard to think about that, particularly if you're linking or trying to link supplements that aren't in the same calendar month. You get this very complicated rotating panel design. And then you also have to think about the same issues of comparability of measures over time. We've taken care of that as well. We have gone to the trouble of linking all CPS records from 1976 forward. So we've linked all the basic surveys to the degree that they can be linked, right? The rotation group design is such that some people this month are not supposed to appear in the CPS next month. But we've linked everyone who should be linked from 1976 forward for the monthlies and for most of the supplements. ASEC is a little trickier for technical reasons, and there we've linked from 1989 forward. Again, these are all freely available on the IPM's website. We should begin to think of CPS, and we should always use CPS now, as a short-term panel study of 16,000 household-based people with a fresh, large sample starting every calendar month over 40 years. This is an amazing longitudinal data resource where you can study short-term change within people's lives and then look at 4 decades at least of historical change in those short-term changes within people's lives. It's a much more powerful data resource than people have been able to use it as to this point. Let me talk about the future. And these are things that are on the drawing board, but that will be here in 5 years. And these are the kinds of things that we will all be using 5 years from now, or maybe 10. So, as I said before, we have census microdata for censuses from 1850 forward. Those of you who have used census data know that you very often are restricted to having like a 5% sample, or for some of the older samples, a 1% sample. Those days are gone. We now have 100% microdata for 1850 through 1940. So we don't need to deal with samples anymore, which is very useful for a variety of purposes. What I want to talk about are 3 initiatives going on around the country. MPC has some role in each of them, although some are not mainly our initiatives. The first is the IPM's Multi-Generational Longitudinal Panel. This is an IPM's product, or it will be an IPM's product. The idea here is to link all census data from 1850 to 1940. So longitudinal data on everybody over 90 years. The second is CLIP, the Census Longitudinal Infrastructure Project. Many of you probably already know something about this. It's run by the Center for Administrative Records Research and Applications at the Census Bureau. In a nutshell, the idea of CLIP, first of all, is to link the 2000 census to the 2010, the short forms, not the long, there's no long form in 2010, but also to link that to 1940, which is in process, ongoing. That's a powerful data resource. But then, of course, the main idea of CLIP is to then link that to all federal surveys like the CPS or SIP, and also federal administrative records, anything that has a Social Security number or an alternate taxpayer identification number. Some of these things are more difficult to do than others, but this is the vision, right? The vision is that you have fully linked census records across those 3 enumerations linked to federal surveys and to federal administrative records. The third initiative is the American Opportunity Study, which is led by David Grusky and colleagues at Stanford, but also some other people around the country. The vision here, first of all, is to link, first you have to digitize, but then link census records from 1960 through 2000, and then plug that in to the same set of federal surveys and federal administrative records. So each of those is partial, but those 3 groups are collaborating. And 5 to 10 years from now, what we'll have is this. We'll have the IPM's Multi-Generational Longitudinal Panel, plus the CLIP, plus the American Opportunity Study. And what you have then is longitudinal data on virtually everybody from 1850 forward, all plugged into modern federal surveys and federal administrative data. And of course, there's hoops to be jumped through, and there's all sorts of logistical things that have to be worked out. But there's no reason not to plug in your own survey data, right? So a person like me, maybe, who gathers, I'm a sociologist. If I do a sociological survey where I have identifying information about individuals, conceptually, that can be plugged in to this apparatus. So I can have information from administrative records, but also historical information about people's families going back to 1850. So I'll pause here and let you imagine what you would do with these data. Right? I don't have any results, but if you had longitudinal data on everybody from 1850 forward, plugged into all manner of federal survey and administrative data, what would you do first? Pause. Imagine that over dinner, perhaps. Let me leave you with two take-homes. The first is, if you're analyzing CPS data, and especially if you're linking CPS records over time, you should use the IPM CPS collection, or you should at least consider it. It will vastly simplify your effort to produce longitudinal analyses using the CPS. And second, a general point is that data silos are crumbling. Data are becoming interoperable and connected. It's time, I think, to reimagine what is possible for research on the kinds of topics that you all have been talking about today. Because as silly as it seemed when I was in graduate school to think about having the IPMS collection, I think 10 years from now we will think of it as sort of outdated to not think of all data as somehow linkable and easily linked. I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so this is normally where I tell everyone that they can start asking questions, but actually I'm going to use my role as the moderator to engage your attention for a couple more minutes. When we were talking with the organizers of the panel a month or so ago about the panel and what we wanted to talk about, one of the things that struck me was that there wasn't someone on the panel to talk about the administrative data resources within the Federal Reserve System, and also the efforts to use what we commonly call big data at the Federal Reserve Board, and we've made a really big effort in this direction. And since this also seems like, in addition to the survey resources we have, one of the areas where we have a lot of ability to produce new and interesting data and really to be on the forefront of where we're going with data and data technology, I thought it was worth it for me to spend just a couple of minutes to be like, and don't forget about these things. So we tried to get some experts in. I'm not the experts on these data, but I didn't want to get lost in the, that in fact, there's a big effort on this in the system. So the system has access to a wide variety of administrative data that can be used to examine issues related to economic inclusion. Actually, Wilbert talked about a lot of this already. Not all the data are equally useful in terms of providing data on gender, race, and ethnicity. A lot of them do have very detailed geographic data, which can be used to get at similar issues by linking it up, say, to county level data or even census tract data. And as he also discussed, there are opportunities to match across the data sets. So for instance, he talked about the work that Neil Buddha has done with some co-authors. The HMDA data have information on race and ethnicity, and there's been an exercise matching those to the consumer credit panel. And that just increases the usefulness of these data for looking at issues related to economic inclusion. It's also worth pointing out that we already have a great infrastructure within the system for using these data. So for instance, the data on mortgages and consumer credit for the system are all available through the radar system, which makes it very easy to access these data. And I think one of the things we should be thinking about, and at Kansas City they are thinking about, is how to make even more data available easily to people throughout the system. So the board, and I'm sure there could be efforts going on about this at reserve banks, but I don't know about those efforts, so I'm sorry if I'm leaving out an important effort, but I'm just going to talk about big data efforts at the board with which I'm familiar. So we've got a big, push now to try to explore the usefulness of big data for our policy work and analysis. And from that, we've also been able to start doing a lot of interesting research using these data. So for instance, First Data provides credit card transaction level data from the firm. So it's where the transaction takes place, and that includes a lot of geographic detail. So we've been able to look at issues like how has weather affected consumption and spending in different states, and we're trying to explore whether those data will be able to get more individual level data about the people making the purchases as well as the transactions themselves, and looking at opportunities to link up these data with other data sources that can help to make them more useful. We're also looking at the ADP payroll data. So these are individual employment records that include information on gender and age, along with the detailed information on earnings, hours, taxes, and extensive benefits data. We're also actually looking into a relationship now with Glassdoor, which is an online jobs posting data source, which has detailed information about the skill requirements of postings. So these are just sort of the sampling of the types of data that we're exploring using, which I think are particularly pertinent for the types of research that people here are interested in. I think one of the big tasks for us now actually goes back to some of the issues that Philip raised with the data that he's using, which is carefully understanding what's the population. A lot of times you have a population here, but what exactly is that population? What's the selection in terms of who who the population is generating these data? Understanding the selection, understanding how the data are constructed. So we're also facing similar issues where a lot of times the data come to us as a black box that a private company has already manipulated, and trying to understand exactly what those data consist of. So there are lots of challenges we're facing using those data, but we're gaining practice. You're trying to use them and exploring, understanding what we don't know about them. So I just sort of wanted to say these efforts are out there. A lot of them are very well developed, our use of a lot of the administrative data. Some of them are more in their infancy, but it's definitely something to keep our eye on as we look to do further research on economic inclusion, to think about how we can make use of these data sources. And with that, now I will open it up to questions. I think I see, yeah, Bob.
I want to channel a question that actually Glenn Lowry should be asking, and
he's like me.
This has been a fantastic, for any of us who are data hounds, a fantastic panel. I want to comment on one narrow thing, which is that it seems to me that measurements of network connections of individuals are vastly under-investigated or under-measured in this domain. That's the jargon I use for that is social capital, but I'm not trying to push social capital. I want to just give three quick examples of why, for this purpose, the Fed ought to be interested more in network connections of the people that you're measuring interesting. One, labor markets. We know that labor markets are filled with the importance of social networks. That's been talked about here. I'm just, because I'm trying to be quick, I will just leave it there. But social networks are crucially important, even in the age of the internet. Social networks are crucially important for job placement. Two, how to deal with financial emergency. I don't know how much data are currently in those wealth surveys about networks, but I'm willing to bet you quite a bit that many people, especially in the lower parts of distribution, their main resource, if they had a financial crisis, $400, is not to go to the bank and borrow $400. It's to call mom or call dad or call an uncle or even non-relatives. So I believe that for those sorts of, that for responding to financial emergencies, for many people in America, social networks are actually the first line of approach. Thirdly, and I'm going to be summarizing very quickly a research that I reported to the Joint Economic Committee in Congress last week. We know that a lot of people are going to retire. We know that that's going to be costly because they're going to need elder care. We know that currently the best estimates are that 3/4 of that elder care today is provided informally, not in the marketplace, but by cousins or children or spouses or churches or whatever. What we also know is that the boomer generation, which is now about to retire, has on average, and this is where I can tell you a lot that lies behind this, have on average 30% fewer social connections than their predecessors. They have 12% fewer spouses, they have 35% fewer kids, they have 40% fewer they have 30% fewer friends, close friends, and they have 40% fewer ties with religious institutions and so on. So what that means is that our current estimates, the best current estimates, take into account that there are going to be a lot more boomers. The best current estimates assume that the boomers will have the same amount of informal social care as their parents. But that just is extremely unlikely to be true because they're entering that on an age-adjusted basis. They have about 30 to 40% fewer social ties than their parents did at the same age. And that means that the 3/4 of currently informally provided elder care is going to be cut roughly by 1/3. And what that means is that 1/4 of elder care that is currently provided paid, that's home health care aides and it's long-term care and so on, is going to have to double because we've got to make up the missing quarter. Is the math of that clear? And that means that, for example, projecting the future of Medicaid, which is the main way in which we pay for long-term, the main public way in which we pay for long-term care, the current estimates account for the fact there are going to be more boomers, but completely ignore the fact that the boomers are going to be arriving there with many fewer social networks. I talked too long, but what I'm trying to say is I think for a lot of problems that you guys care about, you should be systematically gathering some kinds of data on social networks, the social networks of the people you're already interviewing.
Can I? A quick comment on sort of two of the things you mentioned there, just because they actually, first of all, 100% agree with you in terms of the importance of all of the various social networks and being able to capture that. In the shed, we do a little bit of that. So for example, with the $400 question, you're absolutely right. So for people who say that they would not pay for a $400 emergency using cash or credit card to pay off at the end of the month, the most common way that they'd be paying for it is with a credit card that they're going to then pay off over time. The second most common way is by borrowing from friends or family. So I think you're absolutely right that that is an important component of a lot of these issues. I think that in terms of sort of the aging baby boomers, again, I agree with you, certainly for our survey in particular. One of the things we're interested in more is the way that people are interacting with people outside their household for assistance, providing assistance, receiving assistance, et cetera. We do actually, for people who are living with their parents and think about the living arrangements, one of the things we actually added this year precisely for that reason is asking people, why is it that you're living with your parents? And as you expect, a lot of people are doing it to save money, but we actually do see a non-trivial fraction of people that are living with their parents in their late 20s or in their 30s are saying they're doing it in part to provide assistance for those parents. It's not always the child that's receiving assistance. There's also some assistance going in the opposite direction, which includes both the financial as well as the health reasons. So I think that you're absolutely right that these are important issues we need to be thinking about. I don't think that the shed goes anywhere near far enough yet. I think that sort of the outside this home part is important, but you're right that those are important things to consider.
So, Warren talked a lot about the future of linking different data sources together. So one area that I didn't hear anything spoken about, which I think is A, crucially important for if we understanding labor market inclusion, and B, where other countries have been much more successful, is firms and linking individual people to firms. So I was wondering if there's EPUMs, I'm one of the people who's an extensive user and just found out today how to pronounce it.
If you like.
You need to put a thing on the website with how to pronounce it.
It's there.
It's there? Busy downloading data. Or the Fed. Are there any efforts or ideas about how we can do better in that area?
IPUMS doesn't have any plans to link firm-level data, but it doesn't mean it's not a good idea or something we shouldn't do.
So I've worked on other projects that are fortunately not based on our data. A lot of these live at Census or Social Security. Fatih is here. And we, for example, have used the employer identification numbers on earnings records to kind of assemble firms and think about earnings dynamics and the relationship between firms and individuals. And Census really is the hotbed of this. John Halterwanger and his team. There are some Fed researchers who do work on this, but I think you're getting into some of the most confidential data, and that's where some of the issues. And I love Rob's dream, but you also do run into confidentiality when you start pulling these things together. I know with IRS, we, for example, have to be very, very diligent about how we do things.
So yeah, we've done a limited exercise where we link the CCP, the individual credit reports, to similar data on small business owners. So there's more the business side. So we can look at trade credit, delinquencies on those, and bankruptcies and so on. But it's not. There's the information there on how many people work at the firm. It's somewhat limited. Their revenues and so on is kind of limited, but we are actually working on expanding that. We were close to getting a deal and the contract fell through. We're trying again, so stay tuned.
I was just going to add that the board is looking into becoming a research data center for the census, and a lot of other Federal Reserve banks have already done it or are also looking to do that, and I think that will make those data more widely spread. But as John said, that one of the big hurdles you have to get over is getting IRS approval for the project, and that's just very difficult. I have an economist in one of my sections who's been waiting for the project is approved and the IRS has taken over a year to actually say he can use the data, so that's a big hurdle. I think I saw someone back there, first. Yep.
Well, first, I'm really grateful to Professor Putnam for his comment. Okay. And I just wanted to comment that I'm at the University of Minnesota, and I think we're probably within the next 2 years going to identify really sophisticated social network analysis as a core data analytics skill, along with regression analysis kind of thing. So I'm really grateful for your comments. I'm also thinking about all of these, the extant data sets that you're talking about. And during the break, some of us were talking about just the enormity of the problem and where do you go next? And I keep thinking that when we have access to these data systems, might it not give us the opportunity to ask better, more precise research questions that really do lend themselves to experimental or quasi-experimental design? Because I think sometimes in higher ed, we're shooting in the dark with our experimental questions, when in fact these data systems could point us in a more precise way to some really important questions. So in an entirely different context, there was a huge analysis of extant data around wages of male and female engineers and people in higher ed and engineering, and it led to a blind study of analysis of tenure dossiers, where they took all the names out and realized that the exact same dossier was nominated for tenure if a name attached to it was Donald and not when it was Donna. And that study didn't come about until they did an analysis of the data system. So I'm just wondering if any of you would comment on the opportunity to think more surgically about experimental design as a result of this.
Rob, you've got to see places at MPC where it leads to this.
I'm not on that example, but yeah, when you have massive data sets, you have the capacity to do very targeted analyses of particular population groups.
I would use it as an opportunity to plug what I was trying to say at the end when I was rushing, which is when I think about a survey, the best type of survey is one where people don't have to sit through it, right? Because we have a lot of trouble collecting data. CPS response is down. All of the major public use surveys, the response rates are way down. But imagine starting with something where you know a lot of the information already. It doesn't speak too much to your example, but there are just gaps you want to fill in. There are questions you want to ask them. Imagine starting with credit bureau data and pulling a sample from that and asking them questions about how they got into the situation they were in, and you don't have to tell them what you already know about their credit bureau data. You just want to ask them some new questions. That, to me, is the future of the administrative survey data linkage going forward.
Yeah. Also, I really appreciate this session. I'm a big user of all this data, so I'm really grateful. Even though sometimes when I was a graduate student, some people told me data are like sausages. You want to use them, you don't want to know how they're made, but it's useful to actually know. But I have a question, especially for you, John, about the SCF. You said, because data quality is a really big issue, measurement error is, so it's really useful that you actually go through, and you say sometimes spend an hour with an answer. But what do you do if the answer, do you go back to the household, or do you just...
We have been known to go back to interviewers, and this might be questions sometimes of a digit. So, did you really mean 100 million or 10 million? And to get those kind of answers. But yeah, I mean, it really is about getting the story to fit together, and all across the income distribution. And I will say also, this is something where Emmanuel's work on using the tax data, with Gabriel in particular with the wealth, has helped us to refine some of what we do and how we look at the data. And we've actually designed programs now to help pre-process the data and raise flags for us and things like that. So it's not a perfect science, but it's one that I think is pretty well honed. Arthur Kenical is the one who put a lot of these systems in place, and we inherited. And I think that really is one of the strengths of the data, is the fact that somebody has looked at it and said, yes, I can understand how this financial situation exists.
Another question for you, John. You mentioned earnings histories and permanent income, and do you have panel data from the tax records on income of the people in the SCF that is publicly, like, that's new to me, so.
Okay, so this is, and I'm glad, thank you, this is a great question. So there's a couple things going on. So we actually have a measure of permanent income, which is your usual income. So we ask the respondents, we get their annual income, but then we ask them, is this different from what your income usually is? And you can take the gap between their actual income and their usual income and do a variance decomposition on it, and it actually looks like the sort of income variability that people like Fatigue get when they look at earnings records, actual longitudinal administrative data. So that's a nice feature. So that permanent income measure is a great classifier. And you'll see in papers that I write using the synthetic cohorts, we use that as a classifier. So that's one answer. The second answer is that there's work underway with, again, the group of people listed on that first slide, where in the SCF we ask questions about your earnings history, not the entire thing, but highlights of it. How many years you've worked, what you did, your top jobs, things like that, when you started, what you earned when you started these jobs. And they're going back and effectively taking other data sets and statistically reconstructing earnings histories, right? So the third answer, and so that is something that they want to create a lifetime earnings measure, not just a permanent income, but a lifetime earnings measure, because that's what you need to know in order to compute things like how much are they going to get from Social Security, so which is a key, as I said, a key element of wealth. And what was the third answer? The third answer is we do, for the group of people who is selected, for that 10% of the records who's selected through the list sample to get the high wealth, we know things about them going back a few years. And so what you get as an SCF user is an inference about their current income, which is not based on just what they reported, but it's also based on our interpretation of those few years of data. We probably could never do anything with that. It would be in violation of the MOU to ever try and publicly release that. But you can be assured that that data is being used to actually produce the final data set.
Alessandra Fogli here at the Minneapolis Fed. So not only I've been using a lot this data, but also been trying to do geography over time, which is still a pretty challenging analysis to do, because geographic units have been changing over time, and there has been a lot of coordination to be done in order to use this data. But also, I've been using sociological measures, and I've been using the General Social Survey, for example, in several papers. So today, because we have, economists and we have sociologists, I see a great opportunity to actually sort of like think about what could be useful from the different surveys. Like economists, have great measures of income, but on the other hand, sociologists have great measures of family formation, attitudes, networks. And I've always had, the problem of which one to use and how to use them because they both have shortcomings. And I think that today we sort of have, these great opportunities of thinking about how and which variables and, could be, useful to make our understanding of, these are all economic but also social phenomena, deeper. We're thinking about expectations, but then, we actually can use the sociologist, knowledge to think about how to incorporate all the things we know. About these different issues. Social networks is one, and the attitude is another one that, we cannot find in the EPUBs. And would be very useful to attach to good, information about earnings, income, and household formation, and migration, or, that would be very, very helpful.
I couldn't agree more. When Professor Putnam was talking, I wrote "add" in 2019. I couldn't agree more that adding some, if there is a short battery that the sociologists know about, that the economists should know about, please tell us what it is. So it can't be super long, but just in terms of thinking about people's networks, I agree with you absolutely. The long-term care example is amazing. So.
And I'll second that in terms of if there's other questions that, and with us, you don't necessarily have to wait till 2019, because we're actually start thinking about that sort of thing actually right now for our next year's survey. So to the extent that there are short questions, a short module, definitely let us know.
Yep. All right. Are there any more questions? Last chance? No. Okay, so I think I'm supposed to tell you we're now finished until 6 o'clock. Dinner will start promptly at 6. And it's back upstairs in the second floor dining room. And I just want to take an opportunity to thank everyone who came and presented today, and to thank our hosts for inviting us all here for what was a really fabulously interesting day. So.